In the Middle Ages, a toothache wasn't just painful. It was a death sentence. No dentists, no anesthesia. Just prayers and pliers, ready to cringe. Think your worst dental visit was bad? Try having a toothache in the 14th century. There were no dentists, no painkillers, no antibiotics, just God a bottle of something vaguely alcoholic, and an overwhelming sense of doom. In the Middle Ages, a throbbing molar wasn't a nuisance, it was an omen. A sharp, stinging little preview of the hell that was coming for you one swollen cheek at a time. Let's set the scene. You're in a freezing, rat-infested hovel. You've been gnawing on black bread that's more stone than grain, and suddenly, bam, your jaw starts to throb like it's got its own heartbeat. At first you ignore it. You're a medieval peasant. Pain is just part of breakfast. But by day 3, your left eye's twitching. Your mouth smells like something died in it, maybe it did, and your family's already lighting candles. Not for recovery for your soul. See, in the medieval mind, sickness wasn't a bacteria thing, it was a sin thing. You didn't catch an infection, you earned one. That rotten tooth god's judgment for stealing that extra onion last Lent. Your gum's bleeding. Maybe you didn't pray hard enough. Maybe you thought something lustful. Maybe, and this one's real, you walked past a witch and made eye contact. So you go to the healer, which is a generous term because half the time it's just a butcher who got bored. He looks at your mouth, nods grimly, and tells you the truth: the tooth must go. Not because he has x-rays or training, but because it looks angry. And by angry we mean black, cracked and pulsing like a cursed turnip. Extraction it is. Now let's talk about anesthesia. There isn't any. Well, unless you count being blind drunk on mead made from fermented onions and regret. Sometimes if you were lucky you'd be told to bite down on leather. If you weren't lucky you bit your own tongue in half during the procedure, and added that to the list of things now hurting on your face. Oh, and by the way, this entire operation is happening in public, probably at the market, right next to a pig. There's a reason medieval people didn't smile in paintings. It's not because they were solemn, it's because their teeth looked like they'd been through a bar fight and lost. Most adults had some level of dental ruin by their 30s, and when a tooth went bad, it didn't just rot quietly. No, it swelled. It oozed. It caused abscesses so big they could close your throat, jaw infections that crept into your bloodstream and introduced you to death medieval style, slowly, painfully, and with an audience. This wasn't rare. This was normal. There are written records, real official documents of people begging the Virgin Mary to cure their toothaches. That was the plan. Not floss, not rinse. Just scream a Hail Mary, clutch your face and hope the pain either went away or you did. And if you think we're exaggerating, consider this: there were churches with altars specifically for tooth pain. That's how much of a thing it was. Let's pause to admire how casually horrifying that is. In today's world, a cavity means a quick dentist trip and maybe a lollipop. In the Middle Ages, a cavity meant it was time to rewrite your will and apologise to your enemies. Tooth decay was not a minor issue. It was the first domino in the game of which disease will kill you. First, you think that's dramatic. Tell it to the guy who died because his molar turned gangrenous and ruptured his jawbone. He's not smiling either. Of course, no one understood what caused dental decay. The concept of bacteria wouldn't arrive for centuries. People had theories, though. Fun ones. The most popular, toothworms. That's right. Medieval Europeans believed that actual worms lived inside your teeth and gnawed their way through your enamel like tiny evil roommates. And you thought your dentist's old posters were scary. Imagine the scene: someone holding your jaw open, peering in with a candle whispering, "Yep, definitely a worm." And then the solution. Smoke it out. Pour boiling vinegar into the cavity. Heat up a needle and stab around a bit. Pray the worm leaves. If not, pull the tooth. And by pull we mean yank with metal tongs while someone else holds you down. It was less of a medical procedure and more of a crime scene. Did people survive this? Sure. Just like some people survive falling off cliffs, doesn't mean it's a good system. The real problem wasn't the tooth pulling, it was the aftermath. No antiseptic, no sutures, no come back in a week. Just a hole in your mouth and an open invitation for every infection known to man. If you got lucky, it scabbed over. If you didn't, you got sepsis. If you were really lucky, the local priest buried you with a coin in your hand for the ferryman. Let's talk about the irony. The poor, those grubby peasants we always pity, actually had better dental health than the nobles. Why? Because sugar was a luxury item. The rich had pastries and candied fruit. The poor had turnips. Sugar rots teeth. Turnips do not. So the next time someone romanticizes royal banquets, picture the king smiling through blackened gums trying to chew venison with 3 teeth left. To be fair, not everyone was completely hopeless. Some monks and early physicians experimented with herbal mouth rinses, peppermint vinegar salt water, but even these were seen as suspiciously unnatural by many. After all, why wash your mouth when the pain is clearly divine punishment? Best to let the Lord handle it. With boils and pus and night screams. This is the part where you might start to feel your own molars. You run your tongue over your fillings. You feel grateful for your electric toothbrush and your judgmental hygienist named Carol. You consider flossing tonight. Good. That's the right response, because if this section has taught you anything, it's this: the history of dentistry is not a clean clinical thing. It's a blood-slick horror story told in 3-act agony, and yet this was life. Not some dark corner of it, not a rare misfortune. This was Tuesday. This was every village, every town, every person with a sweet tooth and a cursed bicuspid. The story of medieval teeth is the story of survival against screaming odds. A constant low-level war happening in the mouths of people who didn't even know what plaque was. Just that it hurt, badly, until it killed you. So the next time you gripe about a dentist appointment, remember them. The groaning monk, the red-faced butcher, the weeping peasant clutching their jaw and whispering prayers into the dirt. They paved the way with screams so you could have whitening strips. And if your gums still bleed when you floss, just be glad you're not holding a candle over your own face looking for worms. If you ever thought your current dentist was a little too chatty, imagine one who shows up with a jug of ale, slurring his words, holding rusty pliers and wearing a blood-stained apron that might have once been white. Congratulations, you've just met your medieval dental professional. Well, not a dentist. That term didn't exist. The man holding your face in his filthy hands was most likely a barber, blacksmith, or a travelling tinker who got bored with sharpening knives and figured how hard can pulling teeth be. Let's be honest, medieval dentistry wasn't a job. It was a side hustle. Nobody trained, nobody certified. There were no degrees, no dental boards, no pamphlets with glossy photos of smiling patients. There were just people with tools, booze, and a very flexible definition of hygiene. The qualifications: own a chair, have access to metal, be too drunk to flinch when your patient bites your hand out of reflex. The most infamous of these freelance dentists were barbers. Yes, the same guys who cut your hair. Only back then barbers did everything. Teeth bloodletting, wound stitching, bone setting. If your head had a hole in it, natural or not, they'd poke around inside. Their shops smelled like hair, blood, sweat, and stale prayers. The iconic red and white barber pole. That's not just decorative. It's a literal symbol of blood and bandages. Cozy, right? Now picture this. You walk into your local tavern/barber shop. Yes, that was a thing holding your jaw in agony. The barber looks up from sharpening his shears, finishes his beer, and motions you to sit. No gloves, no sterilization, no questions like, "Are you allergic to anything?" Instead, he takes a sip from a mystery flask, wipes his hands on his pants, and reaches for a wrench. You don't scream yet. That's later. Pain management was a coin toss. Some barbers offered alcohol, others offered prayers, and some just told you to be a man about it. One famous medieval remedy suggested stuffing a live frog into your mouth to distract the pain. Others rubbed crushed herbs into the gums, which was mildly soothing until the herbs caused ulcers. But honestly, the most popular painkiller was the passage of time. Either the pain left or you did. The tools of the trade weren't so much tools as blunt trauma devices. Tooth keys were a favourite. Imagine a corkscrew crossed with a crank handle designed to twist your tooth out like a stubborn nail. They didn't always work. Sometimes the tooth broke in half. Sometimes the jaw did. And if you dared to flinch mid-extraction, the dentist might take that as permission to keep twisting. After all, he was doing you a favour. These men had nicknames: tooth pullers, jaw crackers. In France they were called arracheurs de dents, which literally means tooth snatchers. They roamed fairs and markets like grim entertainers setting up booths next to the puppet shows and sausage stands. People would gather to watch. Some brought their sick relatives. Others just came for the screams. It was cheap entertainment, like medieval YouTube but louder and bloodier. Let's talk about hygiene or lack thereof. These tools weren't cleaned between uses. That plier in your mouth. It's been inside 5 other people this morning. The blade on the chair wiped on someone's tunic and reused immediately. Infections, rampant, pus, expected, tetanus. Basically a rite of passage. If you didn't get sick after the extraction, people assume the demons left your body peacefully. In cities you might find a tooth drawer with slightly more skill. Emphasis on slightly. These semi-professionals often worked under guilds and had repeat customers. They charged more, wore fancier clothes and used prettier tools, but the result was the same. You sat down, you bled, and if you were lucky you got to keep your tongue. In villages, though, there were no options. If someone had strong hands and owned pliers, they became the dental authority by default. One recorded case from 1386 involves a tooth drawer named Pierre le Cogneur, who allegedly yanked out 12 teeth in one day 8, of which the patient didn't ask to be removed. Why? Because he was drunk, miscounted, and kept going until the screaming stopped. There was no malpractice lawsuit, no Yelp review, just a quiet burial and a sigh of relief from his other patients. Well, at least it wasn't me this time. And then there were the travelling showmen, half magicians, half butchers, all enthusiasm. These men went town to town promising miracle cures. For 1 coin, they'd yank your pain away. For 2 coins, they'd offer you a potion made from goose fat and garlic that supposedly soothed the gums and frightened the worms. Some even wore costumes, plague masks, cloaks, animal bones as jewellery. Because if you can't be competent, at least be theatrical. There's a particularly grim image from a 14th century woodcut, a man seated mouth agape as a cloaked figure wrenches a tooth free while holding the patient's nose shut. It's unclear whether this was to keep him from screaming or to make him pass out faster. Probably both. The patient's eyes bulge, blood sprays, onlookers clap, and somewhere in the background a child eats a sausage. That's medieval medicine in a nutshell. It wasn't just men, by the way. Some women took up the trade often, midwives or widows with experience in home remedies. But they rarely had access to tools, so they used their hands. Literally. Ever had a molar ripped out by a woman with calloused fingers and an iron will? Probably not. But someone in 1320 did. And their diary entry probably read, painful, effective, would not recommend. But here's the kicker. As brutal and unqualified as these dentists were, they were often loved. Not because they were good, but because they were available. When your face was swelling, your breath stank of rot, and you hadn't slept in days, anyone willing to stick their hand in your mouth was a hero, even if that hand was trembling from drink and had just pulled a tooth from a pig. It gets darker. Some dentists moonlighted as torturers. After all, who better to inflict pain than someone who already specialised in it? Extracting confessions using the same instruments used to remove molars wasn't uncommon. So yes, the same guy who yanked your tooth last Thursday might be pulling secrets from a prisoner today. Multi-talented, efficient, utterly terrifying. Of course, not everyone could afford even this level of care. If you were poor and unlucky, your only hope was a friend with a strong stomach and zero training. They'd grab a rock, a hammer, or a door tie, some string, and hope for the best. It was the medieval version of DIY dentistry. Blood guaranteed, infection almost certain, tooth removed possibly, trauma lifelong. So next time you sit in a modern dentist's chair, bathed in gentle light, listening to smooth jazz while someone pokes your gums with a sterilized tool, remember this. Your ancestors had to rely on the drunk guy in the alley with pliers and prayers. They survived on courage, luck, and fermented cabbage beer. You have numbing gel and suction tubes. Respect your dentist, tip your hygienist, and maybe whisper a little thank you to the long line of tooth snatchers who paved the road with broken molars and broken noses. Because once upon a time, getting your teeth fixed meant trusting the drunkest guy in town not to ruin your face more than God already had. Let's be clear, calling medieval dental instruments tools is being generous. They were more like medieval torture souvenirs that accidentally found their way into someone's mouth. Sharp, crude, unwashed, and sometimes still stained with someone else's tragedy, these devices weren't designed for precision. They were designed for speed screaming and the slim chance that something might be yanked out before the patient passed out. And if the tooth didn't come out, well, at least the swelling might distract you from the rest of your miserable existence. Medieval dentistry didn't aim for fixing anything. It aimed for ending things, ideally before supper. Top of the list, the tooth key. Think of a wrench, a meat hook, and a really bad idea all rolled into one. It looked like an instrument invented by someone who'd never seen a tooth but hated them on principle. You hooked it onto the offending molar, twisted hard, and hoped the root came with it. It often didn't. What it did do was snap teeth in half, crush neighbouring teeth, and occasionally shatter the jawbone like an overcooked drumstick. They called it a key because it unlocked the tooth. The only thing it unlocked was the gates of hell. Then came the pelican. Cute name, horrifying reality. This beast looked like a beak and was designed to grip the tooth and lever it out. The trouble is it levered everything out: teeth, gum tissue, and sometimes parts of your soul. It was mostly used for front teeth, because why not take away someone's smile and their dignity in one brutal motion? If the patient didn't black out, they were considered strong. If they did, the barber surgeon assumed success and moved on to lunch. Not to be outdone, there was the dental mallet and chisel combo. This was for when you didn't want to pull the tooth, you wanted to break it until it surrendered. Picture this. A small chisel is placed against the base of the tooth. Then a wooden mallet. Yes, a mallet smashes down on it. The tooth shatters, blood flies, screaming ensues, repeaters needed. If this sounds like dental demolition rather than surgery, that's because it was. Let's not forget the pliers, not special ones, just pliers. The same kind you'd use to fix a door hinge. Barbers and blacksmiths used them interchangeably for teeth nails and maybe horseshoes if things got slow. They came in one size, brutal. Grip strength was everything. If your barber had shaky hands or the beer hadn't kicked in yet, your extraction might last a little longer and feel like a medieval drum solo performed on your gums. And then there was the hot iron. This one wasn't for removing teeth. It was for sealing the wound after. Cauterization was the go-to method when you couldn't stop the bleeding, and didn't mind adding third-degree burns to your mouth trauma. Heat up a metal rod, jam it into the gaping socket, and pretend the sizzle means healing. You couldn't scream because your mouth was full of fire. Some people passed out, others didn't. The strong ones lived. Sometimes. What's that you're wondering about, cleaning these tools? That's adorable. No, they weren't sterilized. They were wiped, if you were lucky. Maybe rinsed in stale beer. The idea of bacteria hadn't been invented yet, so the closest thing to sanitation was superstition. Some barbers muttered prayers before pulling a tooth as if divine intervention would scare the gangrene away. Spoiler, it didn't. Storage was no better. These kits were usually rolled in leather wraps or tossed into wooden boxes next to coins, knives, or leftover lunch. The tools smell like iron meat and fear. If you heard them clinking as the barber approached, it was already too late. Some barbers carried their kits like trophies. Others hid them like sins, Either way, they were one misplaced sneeze away from tetanus roulette. Now picture the atmosphere. You're seated in a chair made of splinters. The tools are laid out in front of you like an executioner's buffet. There's no anesthesia, no friendly assistant, and no sterile blue bib. There's just you, the smell of blood, and a man holding something that looks like it belongs in a butcher's shop. He picks up the tooth key, smiles with one tooth and says, "Hold still." You do, mostly because you're frozen in terror. Sometimes they used hooks, actual curved hooks, to dig around the gums and loosen stubborn teeth. These weren't designed for dental use. They were often repurposed from fishing or butchering. The hook would slice into the soft tissue-tearing ligaments, while the barber hummed a cheerful tune. Blood lots, precision none. The tooth might come out, the rest of your mouth might too. Then there were the tongue depressors, which weren't wooden sticks, they were literally fingers. The barber would shove a thumb in your mouth to hold the tongue down while manoeuvring a spike into your molar. If you bit him, he'd slap you. If you threw up, he'd call it a cleansing. One way or another, the session ended in a puddle of blood, sweat, or regret. Oh, and let's not forget string. Sometimes the most advanced tool in the kit was string tied around a tooth and then attached to something dramatic like a slamming door or a running goat. This wasn't a joke. People actually tied teeth to animals and scared them into motion. One tug, one scream, one possibly missing jawbone later, and voila, tooth gone. Also possibly consciousness. All of these tools had one thing in common: violence. There was no finesse, no gentle touch, no guided x-rays or ergonomic design. These were brute force instruments operated by men who'd never been taught the concept of minimum necessary damage. Their motto was, if it doesn't come out easily, hit it harder. If it breaks, keep pulling. If it bleeds, cauterize. If the patient dies, well, at least they're not in pain anymore. So why did anyone agree to this? Because the alternative was worse. Living with a rotten tooth meant constant pain, facial swelling, and the looming risk of death by infection. People lined up at markets, churches and back alleys hoping someone would have the right tool to rip the misery out of their skulls. And they paid for the privilege. Not much, just a few coins. But still imagine handing over your last penny to be assaulted with a wrench. Today's dental instruments are works of art. Polished metal, precision tips, sterile packaging. Back then it was iron and hope. That's it. If your barber's hand slipped, you didn't just lose a tooth, you might lose part of your cheek, your tongue, or your life. These weren't tools, they were declarations of war on enamel, and nobody won. So next time you visit the dentist and see a tiny mirror and a buzzing polisher, take a moment. Appreciate the lack of blood, the absence of screams, the beautiful, beautiful numbness of Novocaine. Then remember the pelican, the key, the mallet. And say a quiet thank you to the centuries of cracked skulls and broken jaws that brought us to the clean humming chair you're sitting in. Your dentist may not be perfect, but at least they're not holding a meat hook. Let's get something straight. Nobody in the Middle Ages said cheese when taking a picture. Not just because cameras didn't exist, but because showing teeth in public was basically flashing your biggest insecurity. Smiling meant exposing the battlefield in your mouth, cracked molars, black stubs, green film, and gums puffed up like angry marshmallows. And guess what? That was normal. If your smile didn't resemble a crime scene, people thought you were the weird one. Medieval teeth weren't just bad. They were tragic. Think mouldy bread left in a boot soaked in wine and rolled down a hill. Now imagine chewing with that. Without toothbrushes, fluoride, or basic self-respect, people relied on whatever they could find. Ash salt vinegar even crushed bones. Some even used wool. Yes, wool. Not to clean, just to mop up the mess afterward. Because nothing says oral hygiene like rubbing a dead sheep's sweater across your gums. Let's talk diet. It was a dental apocalypse on a plate. Nobles feasted on sugar-glazed meats, honeyed pastries, and fermented wine with enough acidity to melt enamel. Peasants gnawed on coarse bread laced with sand and grit from stone-ground mills, turning each meal into a dental demolition derby. Either way, your teeth took a beating. And without calcium supplements or modern dentistry, once those teeth broke down, they stayed down. Rot set in fast and infection followed like a loyal sidekick. What about brushing? Oh, sweet summer child. No one brushed their teeth in the modern sense. At best, you might rinse your mouth with wine because it was cleaner than the water and call it a day. Some chewed aromatic twigs or mint leaves which helped with the breath but did nothing for the bacteria setting up a kingdom between your molars. Imagine trying to clean a rotting log with perfume. That's medieval oral care. And mouthwash. Absolutely. If you count spitting blood after chewing cloves as mouthwash. Some physicians recommended rinsing with vinegar and salt, which sounds almost reasonable, until you remember it was poured into open sores, cracked enamel and bleeding gums. It didn't clean, it punished. A good rinse left you crying, a bad one left you unconscious, and nobody considered stopping, because they believed pain meant it was working. Now back to that smile or lack thereof. Medieval portraits are famously tight-lipped, and it's not because people were shy. It's because they were hiding something. The mouth was the place where dignity went to die. A noble woman might spend hours dressing, perfuming, and posing only to press her lips firmly shut lest anyone see the horror movie playing behind them. Even kings avoided smiling, not because they were above it, but because royal rot smells worse when you're rich. Children fared no better. Baby teeth came in white and promising, but without care they quickly turned to chalk. By age 10, many already had cavities or missing teeth. Tooth fairies weren't bringing coins, they were sprinting away in terror. And as for the elderly, those lucky few who made it past 40, most were completely toothless, gumming their bread like war veterans reminiscing on the great battle of Primula's past. Now here's the kicker, some people like the rot. Not in a weird way, well, maybe a little, but because it was familiar. A rotten mouth wasn't scandalous, it was relatable. You couldn't judge someone for their breath if yours could strip paint off a door. Bad teeth meant you were alive struggling and probably not a witch, because everyone knew witches had perfect smiles. It's in the Bible. Okay, not really, but try convincing medieval peasants otherwise. Let's throw in a fun fact. The term long in the tooth comes from horses, not humans. But if it were about people, it would fit the Middle Ages perfectly. Gums receded like bad roommates, exposing long, scary-looking roots that made everyone's smiles resemble skeletal grins. It didn't matter how old you were. By 25, your mouth had already seen war, famine, plague, and possibly a pelican wrench. Every year added a new crack chip or mysterious black spot. And the smell? Oh, the smell! Chronic halitosis wasn't a punchline, it was a way of life. The combination of rotting teeth, infected gums, and constant fasting meant most mouths were chemical weapons. People didn't lean in to whisper secrets, they backed away and hoped their words still landed. Romantic moments were silent. Kisses rare. More like polite lip brushes. You don't make out with a bear trap, after all. Some tried to mask it. They chewed herbs like sage or fennel, carried pomanders, little perfume balls to distract from the oral apocalypse. Others burned incense in their homes, hoping it would outsmell their breath. It didn't. The mouth always won. No amount of lavender can erase the scent of decades-old molar decay. Not even close. Let's take a detour to medieval cookbooks. Recipes weren't written with dental decay in mind. You had spiced wine, caramelized figs, sticky meat pies, everything a cavity dreams of. Sticky food clung to teeth like a curse, but people didn't know that. They thought sweetness was divine, a gift from the gods. No one told them it was also a ticket to facial abscesses and slow drippy death. In fact, rotting teeth were sometimes seen as a status symbol. You heard that right. Sugar was expensive, so if you had black teeth, it meant you could afford it. Nobles flaunted their decay like bling. Look at this gaping hole in my gum. That's 3 tarts and a candied goose. Peasants had cleaner teeth by accident, just from chewing on sticks and surviving off root vegetables. But they didn't get the glory. Clean teeth were for the poor. Rot was for royalty. Some tried home remedies, crushed coral, powdered sage, burnt bread crusts mixed with ash. Rub it on your teeth and hope for the best. Did it work? No. But it gave you something to do while waiting for death. Others swore by prayers. Saints were frequently invoked for tooth pain, St. Apollonia being the most popular. Her statue usually held a pair of pliers and a molar, because subtlety was not medieval Christianity's strong suit. Apollonia became the unofficial patron of rotting mouths everywhere. People lit candles, whispered prayers, and offered her teeth. Yes, actual teeth. Pulled rotting gifted to a statue like some macabre tooth fairy sacrifice. The hope was divine intervention. The result was usually just more infection. But hey, at least it wasn't boring. So here's the reality. The medieval mouth was a war zone, a daily battle between decay superstition and desperation. There were no toothbrushes, no dentists, no warnings about sugar, just teeth slowly giving up on life one crack at a time. And the worst part, everyone thought this was normal. They didn't complain, they couldn't. Their mouths hurt too much. Next time you grin into a mirror, marvel at the miracle. White teeth, fresh breath. The ability to eat ice cream without crying. You live in an age where smiling is painless, and rot isn't a fashion statement. And when you say cheese, you don't need to follow it with a prayer. Say cheese, because unlike your medieval ancestors, you still can. Let's talk about toothpaste, or rather, let's talk about what existed before toothpaste came along and saved civilization from smelling like a compost bin. Because back in the Middle Ages, there was no Colgate, no minty freshness, and certainly no TikTok influencers showing you how to whiten your teeth with baking soda and regret. There were just desperate people, terrible ingredients, and a complete lack of shame. If it could be mashed, burned, boiled, or stolen from a goat, someone tried to brush their teeth with it. Top of the medieval morning routine urine. Yep, human urine. Not metaphorical, not poetic. Just warm yellow, straight from the source pee. Ancient Romans started it, and medieval folks thought, hey, if it worked for those toga-wearing geniuses, let's give it a swirl. Urine was believed to have cleansing properties because of the ammonia, which is chemically accurate, if you ignore the part where it came from someone's bladder. So yes, brushing your teeth in 13 to a year might mean waking up swishing pee and wondering where it all went wrong. And if you were feeling fancy, you could age your urine. That's right, stale urine was considered even more potent. Because apparently fermentation makes it classier. They called it lant, and some medical manuals actually recommended it for gum infections. Want a clean mouth and open sores? Lant's your friend. It burned, it smelled, and it probably invited more bacteria than it killed. But hey, who needs evidence when you've got tradition? Still not sold? Don't worry, urine wasn't your only option. There were ash-based powders made from charred bread crusts, burnt rosemary or animal bones. Grind them into a powder, rub it on your teeth with a rag or your finger, and hope the scraping sound isn't your enamel waving goodbye. Some people added salt for abrasion, which sounds scientific until you remember they were basically sandblasting their own mouths with medieval grit. Teeth weren't cleaned, they were filed down like dangerous furniture. Oh, and honey was sometimes added. Not because it cleaned anything, but because it made the whole experience slightly less soul-crushing. Imagine this, you've got ash salt, maybe some ground oyster shells, and then a drizzle of honey to make your mouth feel like a burnt cookie. Sweet, sticky, and absolutely guaranteed to attract flies. Toothpaste more like toothbait. Other fun ingredients included vinegar, pepper, and crushed eggshells, all of which were readily available and all of which caused bleeding gums faster than a dentist with a hangover. People believed that if it hurt, it was working. If your mouth wasn't on fire, if your gums weren't raw, you were doing it wrong. Pain was progress, comfort was suspicious, and flavour not even on the list. Some herbalists recommended sage and mint, which to be fair actually did something useful. They helped with the smell at least. But these were rare luxuries and most people couldn't afford them, so they used whatever was nearby. Tree bark, animal, fat moss scraped off rocks. One recipe even suggested powdered mouse bones for extra bite. You read that right. Mouse. Bones. Which raises two questions. One, who thought of this? And two, why was anyone still smiling? Now let's address the method. With no toothbrushes, people had to improvise. Rag sticks or fingers were the main tools. The most popular was the chew stick, basically a twig frayed at one end. You chewed it until it looked like a sad little broom, then rubbed it across your teeth like a primitive mop. Did it work? Kind of. It spread the ash and salt around. It moved the grime. It also probably shoved more bacteria into your bleeding gums. Win-win. In some regions, people used goose feathers or porcupine quills to pick at their teeth. Effective. Not really. Dangerous. Absolutely. One wrong poke and you've got a mouthful of splinters or a perforated cheek. But that didn't stop them. In a world without dentists, every sharp object was a potential dental instrument. Toothpicks were the Swiss Army knife of oral care, cleaning, stabbing, and possibly doubling as hair accessories. And of course there were superstitions. Some people believed rubbing your teeth with the skull dust of a criminal would keep them white. Others swore by goat's milk mixed with ashes from a sacred fire. One popular method in Eastern Europe involved rinsing your mouth with wine left under the moon overnight. Moon wine. Because clearly the moonlight knew how to fight plaque. If it sounds insane, that's because it was. But if you've been raised on centuries of God gave you teeth, and God will take them away, you'd try anything. Monks occasionally wrote down recipes for mouthwash. These included everything from rosemary oil to holy water infused with mint leaves. The trouble was, these weren't available to the average person. Unless you lived near a monastery or were a monk, you had to rely on your local wise woman, who might hand you a pouch of crushed beetles and whisper something about Saturn. Science. Nope. Just vibes. Let's not forget the chewing method. Some people chewed on rough grains or coarse bread to scrub their teeth. It didn't work, but it did move things around, which made people feel like progress was being made. Like rinsing your dishes with gravel. Clean, no. Satisfying. Weirdly, yes. It's the illusion of effort that counts when your gums are bleeding and you don't know why. There were also spiritual solutions. If your teeth hurt, it meant your soul was dirty. So naturally, people tried to confess sins as a form of dental care. Not kidding. Priests were sometimes consulted before healers. The idea was purify the soul, and the teeth will follow. Spoiler, they didn't. You can confess all day long, but bacteria don't care. They don't believe in guilt, just cavities. Eventually, some upper-class folks began importing early tooth cleaning powders from the Arab world. These were made with more refined ingredients like pumice, camphor and myrrh, which, while still terrifying by today's standards, were at least a step up from pea and pepper. But again, this was only for the rich. The average peasant still gargling pond water and whispering prayers. Now fast forward to your life. You've got 6 kinds of toothpaste at the store. Whitening, sensitive charcoal, baking soda, bubblegum flavoured. You have floss, mouthwash, a rotating electric toothbrush that's smarter than your phone. And you still forget to brush before bed sometimes. Think about that. Somewhere in history, a man just rubbed rat ashes on his gums with a feather and called it a victory. And here you are complaining about mint being too spicy. So next time you're brushing your teeth, mouthful of foam, hum into music thinking about nothing, pause. Remember the medieval mouth. Remember the lant, the ash, the goat fat, the aged wine infused with moonlight and hope. Say a quiet thank you to every desperate peasant who looked at a pile of moss and thought, yes, that'll clean my mouth. And for the love of all that is hygienic, never complain about floss again. Let's talk about breath. The thing you politely pretend not to smell on public transport. The thing people try to mask with gum mints and denial. Now imagine a world with none of that. No peppermint, no toothbrush, no shame. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where bad breath wasn't just common, it was expected. If your breath didn't smell like something died in your throat last Tuesday, people assumed you were possessed. The average medieval mouth was a bacterial rave party with no security and no curfew. Between rotting teeth, festering gums, half-digested meat stuck between molars, and the occasional mouthful of boiled wine-soaked ash, things got aromatic. You weren't brushing. You weren't flossing. You were praying usually that your breath didn't melt the nose hairs of your loved ones. And here's the kicker no one even noticed. Because everyone reeked. Seriously bad breath wasn't a deal breaker. It was a shared experience. Courtship, bad breath. Church, bad breath. Political negotiations, probably conducted through layers of reeking fog, each participant marinating in their own oral history of decay. If someone didn't have bad breath, people got suspicious. What dark magic is this, they'd whisper. He doesn't smell like warm grave dirt. Burn him. One of the main causes, the diet. Medieval food was a bizarre mix of undercooked meats, pickled fish, and bread so rough it could exfoliate your gums. And don't forget onions. So many onions. Raw roasted, fermented in honey. If you weren't crying while eating, you were weeping afterward from the stench coming out of your own face. Garlic was everywhere. Even the wine had notes of sour grape meats mildew. Your tongue didn't stand a chance. Add to that zero hydration. Water was often too filthy to drink, so people guzzled ale and wine all day. Dehydrated mouths are breeding grounds for bacteria, and bacteria don't keep quiet. They scream in halitosis, so not only were people constantly a little tipsy, they were also mouth-breathing clouds of microbial terror. Forget dragons. The real fire breathers were sitting at dinner. Now let's get graphic. Gums were inflamed, teeth were black or missing. Plaque built up in thick yellow layers like coral reefs in your mouth. Food bits got stuck and never left like emotional baggage but chewier. You had pockets of rot inside your face, and those pockets were not silent. They whispered into every word you said. If you tried to whisper sweet nothings into a lover's ear, chances are they heard I love you and smelled rotting badger. People tried to fix it, of course, with herbs chewing twigs and occasionally shoving mint leaves into their mouths like edible prayers. But without cleaning the underlying decay, all you were doing was seasoning your corpse mouth. Imagine sprinkling basil on a week-old fish and calling it fresh. That's what medieval breath freshening was. A desperate, fragrant lie. There's a reason spices were so valuable. Not just for food, but for survival. A rich person could afford cloves, cinnamon and anise to chew, boil, or rub on their gums. These didn't cure anything, but they helped disguise the scent long enough for social interaction to take place without vomiting. The poor, of course, had no such luxury. Their options were chew bark, breathe through the nose, or never speak again. Sometimes people carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with fragrant herbs on chains or belts. Not for decoration, for defence. When someone leaned in for a greeting, you could pretend to admire the pomander while secretly inhaling anything but their mouth. It was the medieval equivalent of holding a scented handkerchief over your face while talking to a landfill. Let's not ignore the medical theories either. People thought bad breath came from imbalances in the body, hot and moist humours, for example. One remedy suggested stuffing your nose with rose petals to balance the internal vapours. Another involved gargling goat milk mixed with ashes. Some even believed bad breath came from the heart. The heart. Imagine going to your local healer and being told your breath stinks because your emotions are impure. Speaking of healers, there was an entire market of quacks selling breath remedies. These included garlic vinegar, yes, more garlic, boiled bones, and even crushed pearl. Want to sparkle and stink? Now you can. One method involved holding a live frog under your chin while chanting. Another swore by swallowing burning sage smoke. None of them worked, but it didn't matter. The bar for improvement was low. If you could bring the breath down from rotting carcass to mildewed curtain, you were a hero. And let's not forget smoking pipes. By the late Middle Ages, some people began burning herbs in pipes, partly for recreation, partly for smell. The idea was if your breath smells like burning thyme, maybe no one will notice the dead tooth stench underneath. It was the medieval version of Axe body spray. Just keep spraying until no one can tell where the rot ends and the perfume begins. Even religion got involved. Saints were called upon for fresh breath, particularly Saint Apollonia, who was already neck-deep in dental trauma fandom. Some people believed praying before eating could purify the soul, and by extension the mouth. Spoiler, it didn't. The plague still came, so did the stench. But at least people felt virtuous as their gums bled. Now let's address the romantic implications. Courtship in the Middle Ages was less about candlelit dinners and more about tolerating someone else's halitosis, long enough to merge your land holdings. Kissing was limited. Mouths were best kept shut. Love letters were preferable to whispered declarations, paper doesn't stink. And if you found someone whose breath didn't make you gag, that was basically a soulmate. Fast forward to today. You brush, you rinse, you floss on a good day. Your toothpaste tastes like tropical rain or glacier mint. And if your breath even thinks about smelling bad, there are a dozen weapons at your disposal: mints, sprays, strips, gums, even tiny breath analyzers that shame you into Listerine. And yet, people still skip brushing before bed. People still go on dates without checking their breath. Somewhere a medieval peasant is haunting your bathroom, shaking their head in furious disbelief. Imagine explaining modern dental care to someone from the 1300s. We have tiny machines that spin. They clean your teeth while humming. We floss with special string. And we use paste made with fluoride, a magic powder that stops holes in your teeth. They'd fall to their knees. Cry. Possibly burn you for sorcery. Because you'd sound like a wizard sent from the mouth gods. So next time you smell someone's morning breath and recoil in horror, remember you're not smelling real medieval breath. You're smelling a modern, watered-down, kale smoothie version of what used to be the global standard. You're blessed. You're lucky. You're not breathing in the ghost of 20 pork pies and half a dead molar. And the next time someone offers you a mint, don't be offended. Say thank you. Because if you lived in the Middle Ages, you'd be the reason mints were invented. Let's shatter a myth right now. Being rich in the Middle Ages didn't mean you had better teeth. In fact, it often meant the opposite. While peasants were chewing on roots, drinking ditch water and dreaming of dry bread, the nobility were dining on what can only be described as dessert disguised as dinner. They had the gold, the velvet robes, the goblets overflowing with wine, but beneath all that luxury was a mouthful of rot sugar and suffering. Because nothing screams aristocrat like needing 4 people to hold you down while your blackened molar gets yanked out with a fireplace poker. The peasant diet, though boring, was accidentally dental-friendly. It was rough, coarse, and painfully unseasoned. Think turnips, cabbage, barley-more cabbage, and bread made from whole grains that doubled as sandpaper. There was no sugar, no spice, no honey-glazed anything. Just fibrous misery. But all that chewing worked like a natural toothbrush. Their jaws got a workout. Their teeth got scrubbed by default. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Now contrast that with the noble table. Picture this: a long candle-lit hall lined with velvet tapestries and trenchers, piled with glazed fruits, candied almonds, marzipan sculptures, and meats slathered in syrupy sauces that would make a modern dentist weep. Sugar was a status symbol. The more you had, the fancier you were. So nobles didn't just eat sugar, they showed off with it. That fancy swan stuffed with honey-soaked figs, pure dental doom. The meat might have been fresh, the fruit might have been fermented, but the sugar that was the real killer. And it wasn't just sugar. It was how often it showed up in everything. Breakfast sweet porridge, lunch spiced wine and honeyed breads, dinner roasted boar with a caramel glaze. Even medicine was sweetened with syrups and powdered candy. Nobles basically brushed their teeth with dessert and then washed it down with more dessert. And without any actual brushing afterward, their teeth surrendered by age 30, packed up their enamel and fled the kingdom. The results were horrifying. Black teeth. Cracked teeth. Teeth that crumbled mid-meal like sad ruins in the mouth. Some nobles had to gum their food despite being in their 20s. Others hired tooth servants to prepare food soft enough for their destroyed mouths. Imagine being so rich you can summon a peasant to mash your peas, but not rich enough to invent floss. That's medieval irony. Of course, the peasants weren't doing great either. Let's not pretend they were the Colgate poster children of the 1300s. They lacked medical care. They suffered from malnutrition. They had no idea what bacteria was. But their diets, by sheer accident, spared them the sugary horrors of noble life. The harsh texture of their bread cleaned more than it hurt. Their lack of luxury kept their molars intact. You don't need floss when your meals are 60% bark and regret. And here's the extra twist: peasant teeth were often stronger. Not because of calcium, no one had enough of that, but because their teeth were worn down evenly. They didn't snack, they didn't graze. They had 2 grim, chewing heavy meals a day full of fibre and pain. Their jaws were shaped by effort. Their enamel eroded slower. Meanwhile, the noble palate was wrecked by excess. Sugar weakened the enamel, acidity finished the job, and luxury made them soft-mouthed and all. Nobles tried to fight this, of course. They chewed herbs. They rinsed with wine. They bought imported powders made of ground coral pearls or ivory, thinking that rubbing wealth on their teeth would somehow cure the rot. It didn't. It just added abrasive erosion to their list of dental sins. And their solutions often made things worse. One popular recipe included vinegar-burnt alum and powdered glass. Great for whitening. Also great for bleeding out of the gums for 3 days straight. Let's not forget the role of fashion. In some courts, blackened teeth became a trend. Not by choice, mind you, but because nobles began associating visible decay with high status. Look at me, they seem to say, flashing a mouthful of molasses-coloured ruins. I can afford to eat myself into dental oblivion. In Japan, centuries later, women dyed their teeth black as a symbol of beauty. Medieval Europeans just let nature do the job. Elegance through rot. Now imagine being a peasant watching all this unfold. You're missing a few teeth from a bar brawl, sure, but your mouth doesn't ooze when you yawn. Your breath smells like onions, not infection. And the noble lord who taxed your last goat, he's sitting in a velvet robe trying to sip broth without screaming. That's victory in a weird gingivitis-filled way. Even graveyards back this up. Archaeologists have examined hundreds of medieval skeletons and found a weird pattern. Peasants had fewer cavities than nobles, fewer abscesses, more intact teeth. Sure, their jaws were worn flat from chewing gravel bread and screaming, but their mouths weren't rotting caves of privilege. Their smiles, when they had reason to smile, were accidentally more wholesome than their masters. Of course, nobles had access to some care. They could afford the wandering dentist with pliers and a prayer book. They had monks to read medical scrolls. They had herbs imported from distant lands. But none of that mattered when their meals were daily sugar massacres. They traded enamel for elegance, survival for status. Meanwhile, peasants in their muddy boots and root-stained teeth just kept chewing. Now think about this in modern terms. Imagine a billionaire eating donuts for breakfast, cake for lunch, candy for dinner, and refusing to brush. Meanwhile, a minimum wage worker lives off salad, whole grains, and budget mouthwash. Who's got better teeth in 20 years? The answer hasn't changed. Wealth doesn't protect your molars. Common sense does. And medieval nobles had everything except that. So next time you pass a fancy dessert table, remember that's what destroyed the aristocracy's smile. That sticky toffee pudding, that candied fig, it's a molar assassin in disguise. Your ancestors might have chewed bark, but at least they didn't die with sugar-crusted abscesses. Peasants didn't have a lot, but they had stronger jaws and fewer root canals. And maybe that's why they survived long enough to give birth to us. Ah, sugar. The modern world's favourite addiction. It's in your coffee, your cereal, your toothpaste, and yes, probably your sadness too. But in the Middle Ages, sugar wasn't just a treat. It was a statement. A rare, expensive, luxurious badge of wealth and power. And like many shiny things in history, it was deadly. Medieval nobles didn't nibble sugar, they worshipped it. Imported from distant lands, guarded like treasure, it was rare enough to impress, and toxic enough to destroy. 1 teaspoon of sugar in 1300 was basically edible gold dust. Having a bowl of candied fruits on your table was like flashing a Rolex made of tooth rot. You weren't just showing off wealth, you were showing you could afford decay. And oh, how it decayed. Sugar clung to teeth like a medieval curse. There were no toothbrushes to stop it. No fluoride. No rinsing unless you count spitting into a bowl between bites. The sugar sat there, fermenting, feeding bacteria like a royal buffet, and in return the bacteria fed you cavities. Not slowly, not politely, but like termites turned up to 11, gnawing, spreading, celebrating every sweet bite with a new hole in your molar. But the nobles didn't care, because sugar tasted good. It covered the flavour of spoiled meat. It masked the bitterness of bad wine. It made everything taste a little less like suffering. And in a world where life was mostly cold dirty, and short, sweet things felt like divine permission to smile briefly before your teeth shattered like sugar glass. Let's break it down. Sugar consumption was mostly limited to the wealthy, but when they indulged, they went all in. We're talking entire feasts ending in sugar sculptures, castles of marzipan, swans stuffed with candied almonds, pears boiled in honey and wine until they looked like lava lamps of decay, and then the pastries. Oh, the pastries, drenched in syrup sprinkled with ground sugar so thick it looked like winter had come early inside your face. There are actual records of noble women losing teeth during dinner, just biting into a candied date, smiling, and then suddenly pop. Gone. A molar sacrificed to the sugar gods. They'd excuse themselves, dab their lips with lace, and continue the meal. Because in court society, collapsing teeth weren't a warning sign, they were just Wednesday. Sugar was also medicinal, by the way. Yes, medicine. Physicians prescribed it for coughs, melancholy, and stomach worms. Got a sore throat? Try sugar syrup. Feeling moody. Take candied rose petals, just threw up in the garden. Have a spoonful of crystallized violets. They called it lechery, a fancy word, for we don't know what we're doing, but at least it tastes good. So imagine you've already got 6 cavities. Your gums bleed when the wind changes direction. Your breath could kill a goat. And now your doctor says the cure is more sugar. That's like trying to stop a fire by tossing in gasoline because it smells nice. Sweet tooth, sweet death. But hey, at least it was a delicious death. Meanwhile, the peasants watched all this from a safe root vegetable-filled distance. They couldn't afford sugar, couldn't spell it. Probably thought it was a myth invented by nobles to distract from the whole dying of gout thing. Their meals were bland, their treats were boiled apples, and their desserts were not dying today. But here's the irony, their lack of sugar saved their teeth. Their punishment became their protection. Even children weren't safe. Noble kids were raised on honeyed milk and sugar-laced bread from birth. Baby teeth fell out early, not because of nature, but because of neglect. Their milk teeth rotted before their parents even noticed. Some children died of jaw infections before they could read, and the ones who survived, they became adults with mouths shaped like war zones. And yet sugar wasn't just about flavour, it was about identity. To be noble was to indulge, to enjoy, to consume beauty, luxury, and yes, the occasional flaming sugar peacock actual dish. The more decadent the dessert, the more powerful you appeared. No one warned them that power had a price, and that price came in the form of dental collapse and sepsis. Let's get gruesome. Abscesses from sugar-induced cavities didn't just hurt, they swelled. Faces puffed up like bread dough left in the sun. Pus oozed. Skin discoloured. Some abscesses burst internally, leaking infection into the bloodstream, and from there, death. Not quick, not clean, but lingering, fevered and humiliating, all because of that second slice of honeyed goose liver tart. Of course sugar addiction wasn't understood as addiction. People just wanted more. It was the original binge. Once they had a taste, they kept chasing it. Entire trade routes were built on it. Wars were fought for it. Colonies were enslaved for it. All to feed a craving that ironically kept killing the very people who demanded it most. History doesn't just rot teeth, it rots morality too. But here's the real kicker, even knowing it caused problems didn't stop anyone. By the late Middle Ages, writers and physicians were already commenting on how soft the nobility had become, how their bodies were weak, their mouths full of sores, their breath unholy. But nobody wanted to give it up. Sugar was status. Sugar was pleasure. Sugar was everything the average medieval person didn't have, and everything the rich were willing to rot for. It wasn't until centuries later that hygiene and sugar finally had their showdown. And even then, sugar won for a while. The Industrial Revolution made it cheap. The rich got fake teeth. The poor got access. Everyone lost molars. And the legacy of that medieval sweet tooth still echoes today in every bite of cake, every donut, every just one more chocolate bar that our modern teeth now politely panic over. So next time you're spooning sugar into your coffee, think about it. Not with guilt, but with awe. You're part of a long, sticky tradition of humans loving something that destroys them slowly. At least today you have toothpaste. You have dentists. You have warning labels and x-rays and regret. Back then they just had dessert and pain. So yes, sweet tooth, sweet death. But what a way to go. Let's say your tooth hurts. It's not just a dull ache, it's the kind of pain that makes you question the concept of joy. Your jaw is throbbing. Your breath smells like wet parchment left in a swamp, and your left eye twitches whenever you chew. You do what any sensible medieval person would do, ignore it and pray. Or maybe you visit the village barber surgeon who smells like mead and hopelessness. Either way, congratulations, you've just opened a brand new gateway to the plague. No, not metaphorically, literally. That tiny cavity, that cracked molar, that innocent-looking abscess. It's not just a local infection. It's a portal, an express route for bacteria to dive straight into your bloodstream like it's Black Friday at the infection mall, and once it's in game over. Because in the Middle Ages, infection didn't stay in your mouth. It packed its bags, explored the body, and often invited its best friend Yersinia pestis. Let's back up. Medieval folks didn't understand bacteria, but they definitely understood suffering. When someone got sick after a dental problem, they didn't think sepsis. They thought curse punishment, or that goat I kicked in 1342 finally got revenge. But what really happened was that a tooth infection turned into an oral abscess, which then turned into cellulitis, which then, if you were really unlucky, and you usually were turned into plague-like symptoms, fever, swelling, death, with a toothache as the opening act. There's a beautiful horror in this. You could die of the plague without ever meeting a rat. No flea bite, no black boils, just one rotting molar that spread its venom through your veins like a sadistic love letter. The line between I have a toothache and I'm being buried under a pile of lime was thinner than the patience of a monk hearing your fourth confession about impure thoughts during Lent. And let's be honest, your environment wasn't helping. You lived in filth. The streets were rivers of mud waste and whatever came out of a horse that day. You drank water that occasionally had bones in it. You washed once a month if the moon was right. Hygiene was theoretical. So when your jaw started to swell and your skin flushed with fever, no one said, let's disinfect it. They said, let's drain it with a knife and hope the evil spirits leave. And they did drain it. Crudely, horrifically, with no anesthesia, no clean instruments, and often no clue where the infection had actually spread. The result, either the patient screamed themselves to death, or they temporarily felt better until the bacteria regrouped and came back with reinforcements. Think of it as a medieval reboot of The Plague Strikes Back, but this time the battleground was your face. There are records of people dying within 3 days of a bad dental infection. Their faces swelled beyond recognition, eyes bulged, necks stiffened, breathing became impossible. Some went mad from the pain, babbling prayers and curses while their families wept nearby. And the worst part, they couldn't even close their mouths. The infection had locked their jaws open like death was trying to escape, but got stuck halfway. Let's say you didn't die immediately. Now you've got a rotting hole in your jaw, a face that looks like you fought a bee swarm and lost, and a reputation for being unclean. People avoided you. Rats stared at you with pity. The local priest started whispering about demonic possession. Because of course, back then if something wasn't understood, it was probably Satan. Tooth infections became spiritual battlegrounds. Monks were summoned, holy water was splashed, prayers were chanted over swollen cheeks. Some even tried exorcisms. If your face exploded after being blessed, they called it proof the devil was leaving. If it didn't, clearly you needed more exorcisms, or possibly fire. Fire always helped when you were out of ideas, and in the background always looming was the actual plague. Bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic, take your pick. And while it was caused by fleas and rats, guess what made your immune system easier to break? That's right, chronic infections. People already battling dental rot were the perfect targets. Their bodies were already weak, their blood already poisoned. So when the plague came knocking, they didn't resist. They opened the door with a swollen jaw and said, "Come on in." You want irony? Some believed that the plague cured tooth pain, because in the final hours when your skin was blackening and your organs were failing, you didn't notice that one throbbing molar anymore. Comfort through catastrophe. Peace via annihilation. The ultimate distraction. Sure, I'm dying, but at least my tooth stopped hurting. Medieval optimism, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes plague doctors took a look inside a dying person's mouth and gasped. They didn't know about germs, but they knew when something looked cursed. Rotted gums, half-missing tongues, mouths filled with pus and despair. Some wore masks not just for the bad air, but to hide their expressions. Imagine trying to keep a straight face while staring into a human compost bin with teeth. There's a reason people prayed to Saint Apollonia like she was the dental avengers. She was the patron saint of tooth pain, yes, but also of not dying from it. People believed she could protect you from the rot, the fever, the face demons. They lit candles, left offerings, whispered desperate chants into their pillows. But Apollonia wasn't a miracle worker. She was more like moral support, a celestial hand to hold while your jaw dissolved. And if you were a peasant, forget it. You didn't even get the saint. You got a bucket of ale, a rusty knife, and a cousin who once pulled a nail out of a horse. You lay on a table, screamed into the void, and hoped the infection picked mercy over speed. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it liked to linger, make you sweat for a week, lose your mind, hear voices. And then just when you thought the worst had passed, bam! Heart stops, jaw wide open. Post-mortem care was a nightmare too. Bodies with swollen faces were feared as plague carriers. People avoided touching them. Sometimes they were burned, sometimes buried deep in unmarked pits, and sometimes if their mouths were open in a final scream they were assumed to be cursed and staked through the chest. Yes, because nothing says dental hygiene like a wooden stake to the sternum. It's wild to think about now. That the simple act of opening your mouth could be a death sentence. That a single abscess left untreated could mimic the symptoms of one of the worst pandemics in history. But that was reality. Death didn't need permission. It needed an entry point. And in medieval Europe, the mouth was always open. So the next time you feel a little tooth sensitivity, don't roll your eyes. Don't say, it can wait. Don't chew on the other side and hope for the best. Remember the faces that swelled, the jaws that locked, the prayers whispered through blood-soaked linens, and for the love of all that is minty, make the appointment, because in the Middle Ages they didn't have that choice. Before we begin, take a deep breath. This one's going to crawl under your skin and straight into your teeth, because for centuries humans believed that toothaches weren't caused by bacteria cavities or infection. No, they were caused by worms. Actual wriggling, malevolent little worms living inside your molars, gnawing on your nerves like squirmy freeloaders with a taste for agony. Sound ridiculous. Of course it does. But in the Middle Ages, this wasn't a fringe theory. It was dental gospel. The belief in toothworms was so widespread, so convincing, that it spanned continents and cultures. Ancient Sumerians mentioned them. So did Chinese scholars, Viking healers, and Arab physicians. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, the idea had calcified like a neglected wisdom tooth. It made sense in a twisted way. You couldn't see the cause of the pain, but you felt it moving, throbbing, burrowing. So what else could it be but a tiny demon worm chewing on your soul? People imagined them in all sorts of shapes. White, black, coiled, hairy, even striped. Some thought they looked like maggots. Others imagined tiny snakes slithering through the roots of your teeth like evil spaghetti. One account from a 12th century German healer described them as thread-like serpents that twist and dance in the gum. Another claimed they sing songs of pain. Medieval imagination didn't stop at horror, it went full symphony of suffering. And then came the remedies. Oh, the remedies. If you believe the pain is caused by worms, what do? You smoke them out. You poison them. You shake them loose. Which led to a collection of dental treatments so absurd, so wildly desperate, they could have doubled as medieval hazing rituals. One involved holding a hot coal in your mouth while inhaling henbane smoke. The idea the worm would get high panic and flee. What actually happened? You burned your tongue and passed out in a ditch. Another popular treatment, garlic and goat fat stuffed into a rotten tooth. The theory worms hate garlic. Apparently so did most of the village. The resulting breath could clear a room, which was great because no one wanted to be near you during the exorcism. Some recipes included human earwax ash bile or powdered frog bones. If it was gross flammable or smelled like defeat, someone had tried to rub it on their gums. And then there was the vibration method. You'd sit down, have a friend grip your head, and then someone, usually the drunkest adult available, would smash a piece of metal next to your aching tooth. The goal was to create such a loud, vibrating clang that the worm would get disoriented and crawl out. No, really. Imagine treating your toothache like you're evicting a squatter with a gong. And if it didn't work, at least now your ears were ringing too. Of course, the holy men had their own take. If worms lived in teeth, they were clearly sent by Satan. So some priests recommended prayers, exorcisms, and relics pressed to the face. There's a documented case of a monk in 1347 who claimed to have healed toothworms by making the patient chant the Lord's Prayer into a hole in a tree while barefoot in the snow. Did it work? Hard to say. The patient died of exposure, but presumably with cleaner teeth. What's truly disturbing is that sometimes something did come out. People would apply a paste or smoke, feel a sudden pain release spit, and there in the bloodied mess would be a thread or a chunk of pus that looked suspiciously worm-like. Cue the screams. The worm is gone, they'd cry, unaware that they'd just dislodged a piece of necrotic tissue or a hardened strand of infected gum. Science wasn't invited to this party. Barbers, not to be outdone, created tools specifically for worm removal. Tiny hooks, curved needles, even tiny tweezers were jammed into cavities to fish out the phantom intruders. It was less of a procedure and more of a fishing expedition in a swamp of pain. The success rate unclear. The blood rate impressive. If nothing came out, the patient was told the worm had gone deeper, and then it was time for round 2. You want nightmare fuel. Some manuscripts from the late Middle Ages included illustrations of these so-called toothworms, coiled little demons with fangs, wiggly horrors with smug faces. Picture your worst enemy trapped in a gummy caterpillar. That's what people believed was living inside their mouths. And worse, they believed these creatures could move from tooth to tooth or even up into the brain. Suddenly a headache wasn't just a headache. It was a worm on the move. This belief lasted a terrifyingly long time. Even into the 1700s, people still referenced toothworms in medical texts. That's not medieval, that's practically modern. The shift only came when microscopes arrived and science stepped in like, hey guys, turns out it's plaque, not Satan's noodles. But by then, centuries of worm-fueled horror had left their mark. You might be thinking, how could so many people believe this for so long? Easy. Pain makes people desperate. And desperation is fertile ground for myth. When your jaw's exploding, your mouth smells like death, and no one has a clue what's going on, The idea of a worm, something you can name, blame, and maybe kill, is comforting. Horrible, but comforting. Even today, echoes remain. Ever hear someone say a pain is gnawing at them? That's worm language. Some folk remedies still involve garlic salt or herbal smoke. And though we laugh at the idea of toothworms, we're not far from rubbing crystals on our gums and calling it wellness. The packaging is fancier, sure, but the desperation same flavour. So here's your takeaway. Medieval people weren't stupid. They were terrified. They listened to the pain. They made sense of the senseless the only way they knew how, through monsters. And when those monsters lived in their mouths, they fought them with every foul, fiery and frothy trick they could invent. Next time you feel that familiar twinge in your molar and you reach for some ibuprofen and call a dentist, remember the generations before you who had none of that. Just prayers, hot coals, and the belief that somewhere deep inside your jaw, a tiny worm was doing the cha-cha of doom. Picture this, you have a toothache so blinding that your vision blurs, your hands shake, and your prayers start including phrases like, "Take me now, sweet death." You've tried everything, garlic frog bones screaming into a bucket. Nothing worked. Then a man named Ulrich with 3 fingers and a smell like fermented despair leans in and says, "Let's try fire." And because this is the Middle Ages and you have no antibiotics or hope left, you say, "Sure, light me up." Welcome to cauterization, the noble art of burning your face in the name of healing. It wasn't just for battlefield wounds or removing infected limbs. No, in medieval dentistry it was a perfectly acceptable, nay recommended treatment for toothaches, gum infections, abscesses and any swelling that dared show its face above the neck. The logic, fire purifies, pain heals. And if it didn't work, at least you were distracted from the original agony by a new, more theatrical agony. Now let's talk tools. These weren't surgical lasers or sleek sterile rods. These were red-hot chunks of iron pulled straight from the fire like the devil's chopsticks. The barber surgeon, who was probably halfway through a beer and still had your neighbour's blood on his apron, would press the glowing metal to your cheek, your gum, or even the inside of your mouth. Sizzle. Smoke, screams, success undefined. If your abscess was external, say a bulging red balloon on your jaw, the treatment was to lance it, drain the pus with 0 gloves or hand washing, and then seal the wound shut by cauterizing it like a cow brand. The goal was to close the door on infection, the result a facial scar that screamed I survived medieval dental care and possibly a secondary infection anyway. But at least you didn't have to worry about that specific pus pocket anymore. Internal abscess. Even worse. The hot iron was sometimes inserted directly into the mouth. Imagine being told to open wide so someone could press burning metal to your gum. No anesthesia, no numbing agent, no sympathy. Just the metallic scent of your own flesh cooking while a guy who cuts hair on Tuesdays mutters something about balance of humours. If you screamed, you were weak. If you passed out, they kept going. That's efficiency. Of course, cauterization wasn't just about stopping infection. Sometimes it was used to kill the nerve, literally burn it dead. If your tooth ached, they might shove a red-hot wire into the cavity and fry whatever was causing the pain. The result? Well, the tooth didn't hurt anymore. Mostly because it wasn't alive anymore. Congratulations. You've traded sensitivity for searing trauma. Also, the rest of your mouth is now a war zone. Let's take a moment to appreciate how often this technique was applied. People didn't use fire as a last resort, they used it as plan A, B and C. Headache cauterized the back of the neck. Swollen gums cauterized the cheek. Mouth odour cauterized the tongue. Some physicians believed fire expelled bad vapours. Others thought it frightened the disease spirit out of your body. All of them were very confident, and very, very wrong. Monasteries weren't innocent either. Monks kept detailed records of procedures done in the spirit of healing. These included burning herbs applied to the face and neck, or smoking the mouth with fiery resins. In one charming record, a patient is described as blessedly relieved of his foul mouth pain following application of God's flame. Translation, we torched his face and he passed out. Peaceful indeed. Even the concept of beauty played a role. Scars were worn like medals. A burn mark near the mouth wasn't embarrassing. It was proof that you'd faced pain and lived. You were cleansed, refined by fire. Sure, you drooled when you drank and couldn't chew on the left side anymore, but spiritually glowing. There's also something deeply human about it, this idea that more pain will cancel out the original pain. Toothache. Let's burn your lip. Infection. Let's set your gums on fire. It's the logic of desperation, a kind of medieval pain math. If pain A plus pain B equals unconsciousness, then congratulations, you've achieved temporary relief. It's not healing, it's distraction. Now let's talk consequences. Cauterization came with side effects, obviously. Facial burns, nerve damage, and secondary infections were just the beginning. Sometimes the procedure went too deep and the heat destroyed part of the jawbone. Other times the swelling post-burn closed off the throat, leading to asphyxiation. But the most common side effect, permanent facial disfigurement. Because nothing says success like a melted cheek. And if you thought this was all back-alley quackery, think again. Respected medical texts from the time written by men in robes with beards and Latin vocabularies endorsed cauterization as standard treatment. They included diagrams, instructions, and cheerful descriptions like, apply heat until the flesh cries out. Some suggested tying the patient down. Others simply advised holding him firm with 3 men and great faith. Great faith in what you ask, apparently fire. There were even travelling cautery specialists who carried their own portable furnaces and offered services at markets and fairs. Next to the juggler and the sausage seller, you could watch someone get their gum charbroiled for 2 silver coins and a half-empty prayer. These healers lit their irons in front of the crowd for dramatic effect, then branded their victims with practiced flair. People cheered, kids laughed, adults clapped. Welcome to medieval medicine meets medieval entertainment. Did anyone ever question this method occasionally? A few radical thinkers whispered that perhaps burning someone's face wasn't the height of healthcare. But those people were usually ignored, laughed at, or accused of sorcery. One poor soul in Florence suggested cleaning a wound instead of cauterizing it, and was promptly run out of town for being soft. Because in the Middle Ages, compassion was weakness, and screaming patients were a sign you were doing your job. Let's fast forward. Today we have antiseptics, antibiotics, and advanced surgical tools. When you get a dental abscess, they drain it with precision. They prescribe medication. They keep you conscious but comfortable. The worst part is the bill, not the third-degree burns. You sit in a clean chair, watch a mounted TV, and get a free toothbrush after. Meanwhile, your ancestors got a red-hot poker and a lifelong fear of fire. So next time you feel that familiar twinge in your gums, don't ignore it. Don't say, it's probably nothing. And definitely don't hand your neighbour a branding iron and say, make it quick. Instead, call your dentist, show up on time, and when they ask, have you been flossing, lie politely. Because even if you're lying, at least they're not lighting anything on fire near your face. In the grand arc of dental history, we've come a long way. From flames to fluoride, from screams to sedation. And thank whatever gods you believe in that no one says let's cauterize it anymore. In the world of medieval dentistry, there were no specialists, only volunteers, survivors, and the deeply misguided. And then there was Brother Theodoric, a monk, a man of God, and if the records are to be believed, the busiest amateur oral surgeon the world has ever seen. In a quiet monastery tucked between plague outbreaks and heresy trials, Brother Theo wasn't just praying, he was pulling, and not metaphorically. We're talking teeth, hundreds of them, every month, with enthusiasm that bordered on holy obsession. Now let's be clear, Brother Theo had no medical degree, no training, no supervision. What he did have was time, a terrifying amount of confidence, and access to more mouths than any one man should ever legally be allowed. He wasn't a physician, he wasn't even the monastery's cook. But somewhere between copying scripture and bottling mead, he decided that dentistry was his divine calling. Because when you live in a world where saints talk to birds and bones perform miracles, why wouldn't God tell you to start yanking molars? According to surviving monastery records, which were half patient logs and half confessions of regret, Brother Theo averaged 10 extractions per day. That's 300 per month. More if there was a festival, a fast, or a particularly bad cheese season. People lined up at the monastery not for prayer or penance, but to have Theo wrench the pain from their skulls. Some came with toothaches, others just came with anxiety and left with fewer teeth. It was medieval minimalism, one incisor at a time, and the tools. Oh, you know the answer. A pair of iron tongs, a wooden mallet, a spoon he filed into something pointy. Sometimes, if the lighting was good and he was feeling fancy, he'd use a fishhook bent into a curve he called the seraphim. One terrified novice monk described the experience as being kissed by God's wrath. Others described it as unbearable, divinely brutal, and in one case I blacked out and saw St. Apollonia dancing. Brother Theo had a method too, a routine. First he'd say a quick prayer, usually something involving cleansing the body and humbling the spirit. Then he'd tell the patient to breathe deeply, relax the jaw, and offer the pain to Christ. Which is monastic, for this is going to hurt like betrayal at the Last Supper, and then yank, crack, spit, amen, pain management. That's adorable. Theo offered a rag soaked in wine if you were lucky. For the truly devout, he'd simply hold a cross up to your face and say, focus on that. People did. Desperately. Because once he started pulling, your options were scream faint or hallucinate your way through the worst moment of your life. Some called it spiritual cleansing. Others just called it trauma. But here's the terrifying part, he was good at it. Sort of. His success rate by medieval standards was shockingly high. Most people survived. Many actually felt better. Sure, they left with blood pouring down their chin, and the vague sensation that a bear had punched them, but the toothache was gone. And in a time when dental pain could last for years, that made Brother Theo something of a legend. A holy extractor, a monk with God in his heart and a plier in each hand. He even wrote about it. In between sermons and garden duties, he scribbled dental advice into the margins of religious texts. Gems like, "A tooth too proud shall be humbled by force, and boil thy iron before it enters the wicked molar." His most famous line, "Pain is but the soul leaving through the roots." Today he'd be flagged by every medical board. Back then he was a hero with a habit and a bucket of teeth. Yes, a bucket. Theo kept the extracted teeth in a clay pot he lovingly referred to as the purging jar. When asked why, he said it was to remind us of vanity's decay. One novice said it was to ward off demons. Another whispered that Theo sometimes talked to it. No one dared move the jar. It lived beside his cot next to a crucifix and a bowl of mint leaves he never used on his patients. But not everyone loved him. Some monks feared he was too eager, too gleeful. There were rumours he once pulled a man's tooth before he even complained. Others said he could smell infection from across the cloister. A few even questioned if he caused the pain just to fix it. These were not quiet criticisms, they were whispered prayers behind locked doors, followed by the sound of distant weeping and one less molar in someone's mouth. Still he kept pulling, year after year, festival after feast. When he wasn't chanting psalms, he was cracking canines like walnuts. Some believed he performed miracles. Others thought he was just the most functional sadist ever to take a vow of poverty. But nobody denied this. If your tooth hurt, and you were within walking distance of his monastery, you went to Brother Theo. Over the years, his reputation spread. People came from villages miles away. They brought their children, their elders, their livestock. He turned those away mostly. He became known as the Tooth Monk, which in the Middle Ages was only slightly less respected than the plague doctor and slightly more popular than the leech farmer. Nobles even sent letters requesting his services, though he rarely left the monastery. His faith, he claimed, was rooted there. like a particularly stubborn molar. Eventually, of course, age caught up with him. His hands trembled, his grip weakened, his extractions became slower, bloodier, more uncertain. He took fewer patients. The bucket filled with fewer offerings. Some say he began dreaming of teeth, giant ones floating in candlelight, whispering scriptures in Latin. One novice reported seeing him weeping over a particularly curved bicuspid. It didn't deserve that he murmured. It was pure. When Brother Theo died peacefully in his cot, surrounded by the smell of iron and basil, the monks buried him with his tools. They placed the tongs beside his hands. The purging jar was sealed and buried at his feet. Some say if you listen closely on cold nights, you can hear him whispering prayers through the wind, followed by the distant pop of a molar leaving the jaw. Today we have dental clinics, Novocaine, orthodontists with degrees and Spotify playlists. But somewhere deep in your ancestral memory there's a flash of pain and a bearded monk looming with a rusted tool. The legacy of Brother Theo lives on not in textbooks, but in nightmares and molar-shaped trauma. So next time you see your dentist smile, show them your plaque-free, pain-free miracle of modern hygiene. Because once upon a time, the man cleaning your teeth might have also been blessing your forehead, chanting in Latin, and pulling at your face with tools he sharpened on a stone behind the chapel. Today a smile is your social passport. It opens doors, wins, friends, closes deals, and makes you look slightly less terrifying when asking for directions. But in the Middle Ages, smiling was weird, suspicious, potentially unholy. Because nothing said I'm definitely hiding something like voluntarily showing your teeth in a time when your mouth resembled a haunted battlefield. If someone grinned at you in 1326, you didn't smile back, you reached for a cross. Why? Because most people's teeth were quite frankly horrifying. We're talking blackened stumps, abscessed gums, yellow fangs and gaps so big you could whistle through them involuntarily. A smile revealed too much. Not just dental decay, but your secrets, your sins, and possibly your demonic possession. In a world where superstition ran faster than logic and hygiene lagged somewhere behind witch hunts, facial expressions weren't just judged, they were interpreted. The church wasn't thrilled about smiling either. In art and literature, saints didn't beam, they glowed. With solemnity, grace, holy constipation. Early religious paintings showed the Virgin Mary with a face like she'd just found out the apocalypse was scheduled for tomorrow. Jesus moody, brooding, compassionate, but never cracking a grin. Smiles were for fools, or worse, temptresses. A woman smiling too much could easily be accused of seduction, or sorcery, or both depending on the weather and the local bishop's mood. And let's not forget the smell. Opening your mouth in polite company was like releasing a secret gas attack. Medieval breath was an assault on the senses, a toxic bouquet of fermented goat cheese, rotting meat particles and regret. So people learned to keep their mouths shut, literally. You didn't show your teeth. You didn't speak unless necessary. You communicated with nods, gestures, and the occasional terrified whisper from behind your hand. But the real nail in the coffin for smiling teeth? Status. And not in the way you think. Today, white straight teeth mean wealth. Back then they meant you were poor, because peasants living off coarse breadroot vegetables and prayer accidentally had better teeth than nobles who drowned theirs in sugar and wine. So flashing a decent set of teeth in medieval society was like admitting you slept in a hay pile and made your own sandals. It wasn't impressive. It was suspiciously humble. This led to an unspoken social agreement. If you must open your mouth, do it carefully. Don't show too many teeth. Don't show them all at once. A tight-lipped nod was acceptable. A slight upward curve of the mouth was daring. An actual toothy grin downright provocative. People might start asking questions like, "What are you hiding in that unholy smile, Thomas?" Or "Why is your mouth so cheerful when the crops have failed again?" Even courtship was affected. Flirting was done with eyes glances and coded phrases about sheep or the weather. Smiling was too bold, too intimate, too dental. A woman who smiled freely risked being labelled loose or dangerous. A man who smiled too much might be considered a jester or worse French. The safest route was always solemnity. Love, but make it emotionally repressed. And then there's the art. Ever wonder why everyone in medieval portraits looks like they just got bad news from their dentist? Because showing teeth was not only unseemly, it was rarely painted. Artists didn't want to spend 6 weeks carefully detailing someone's decayed dental apocalypse. Plus, a painted smile looked unnatural, even sinister. In the absence of Hollywood veneers, a grin wasn't charming, it was uncanny. You want to look respectable. Close your mouth and let your embroidered collar do the talking. Even children weren't exempt. Baby teeth might start out white, but they quickly fell victim to a world with no fluoride, no floss, and no mercy. A child with all their teeth intact was seen less as healthy and more as suspiciously protected by the devil. If little Lucy skipped her toothache years, maybe she'd skipped her prayers too. It was safer to look miserable and infected than too clean. Suffering meant you were righteous. Let's talk drama for a second. Smiling in the wrong context could be legally dangerous. Smile at a grieving widow, disrespectful. Smile during a public hanging, sociopathic. Smile while being accused of theft. Definitely guilty. There are records of people being punished stoned even for smiling at the wrong time. In a town with 3 confirmed witches, 2 baths per year, and 1 executioner on retainer, a smile was basically a confession. In some regions, smiling at clergy was considered blasphemous. Priests were holy men, men of suffering. Joy was not part of their brand. If you greeted Father Bernard with a cheerful grin, he might bless you or slap you. It depended on whether you'd had lunch yet, and if he saw your teeth during confession, expect more penance, possibly dental-themed. And yet, there were exceptions. Actors, minstrels, fools, those were allowed to smile. In fact, they were paid to. But even then it was part of the performance. Their smiles were theatrical, exaggerated, intentionally grotesque. The audience wasn't supposed to find them charming. They were supposed to laugh, or cringe, or both. Smiling wasn't joy, it was satire. A mask worn by those too lowly to be taken seriously. Interestingly, criminals sometimes smiled, especially if they were about to be executed and wanted to appear defiant. One thief famously grinned at the crowd before being hanged, showing off his gap-toothed grin like it was a final act of rebellion. That smile made him legendary, also very dead. But it proved a point in the right or wrong context. A smile could be power. Dangerous power. Let's fast forward. Today we smile in selfies, interviews, on dates and elevators, at baristas who spelled our name Gregory when it's clearly Grace. Smiling is universal, friendly, even expected. It says I'm okay, even when you're clearly not. And if someone doesn't smile, we ask if they're angry, or worse, British. But deep down we carry echoes of the medieval mindset. Ever fake a smile at work until your jaw cramps that's inherited? Ever smile at a funeral because you don't know what else to do? That's ancestral confusion. Ever cover your mouth when you laugh? That's your medieval grandmother whispering, "Hide the rot, dear." So here's your takeaway. If you lived in the Middle Ages, your smile would be rare, risky, and possibly cause for exorcism. Today it's a reflex, a performance, a filtered photo. But every time you flash your well-brushed, minty fresh, non-pestilence-ridden teeth, spare a thought for your ancestors grimacing their way through life with mouths full of misery and social paranoia, and smile just a little wider, because now no one's going to accuse you of witchcraft for it. Are wedding symbols of eternal love, awkward speeches, and the eternal promise of for better or worse? But back in the medieval and early modern periods, that phrase hit differently. Because worse could mean famine, plague, or getting someone else's tooth as a wedding gift. Yes, forget fine china, forget matching goblets. In the weird and wonderful world of historical matrimony, nothing said I love you like handing over a molar. Let's back up. Today we gift couples rice cookers, towel sets, maybe a blender if we're feeling generous. But centuries ago, especially among the wealthy, and the deeply misguided, there was a real trend of gifting body parts, usually in the form of jewellery relics or horrifyingly practical donations. And teeth. Oh, they were prime. Because nothing said wealth and commitment like giving someone the power to chew again. If you were rich and toothless, both very common, you didn't wait around for nature or mercy. You bought your smile, and weddings, perfect excuse. Some brides arrived with freshly implanted front teeth as part of their dowry makeover. Some grooms presented their new wives with jars of teeth as romantic gestures. Look, darling bicuspids, just like you always wanted. That's love. Or at least a deeply medieval version of it. And where did these gifted teeth come from? You guessed it, the poor. Peasant servants, beggars, basically anyone who had teeth and fewer rights than livestock. Wealthy couples would pay them barely or sometimes coerce them into donating a few chompers for the sake of noble aesthetics. Imagine pulling out your tooth so a baroness could smile at her wedding portrait. Now imagine being told you were lucky to be included in the celebration. In 18th century Europe, yes, this madness lasted well past the Middle Ages. It became disturbingly normal for brides to receive tooth transplants right before their wedding day. The procedure was crude. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just a chair, a forceps and a blind optimism that two strangers' dental roots would become best friends. Did it work sometimes? But usually the new tooth fell out rotted or caused an infection so dramatic it ruined both the marriage and the jaw. Some doctors even offered pre-wedding packages, smile enhancements for the noble bride. These included whitening powders, mostly acid gum colour correction, painted on with mercury and, yes, freshly harvested peasant teeth installed right into your face. The idea was to make sure your wedding smile didn't resemble a medieval graveyard. The irony, the procedures were so brutal, most brides couldn't eat the wedding feast afterward. And because medieval romance was nothing if not practical, some grooms gave teeth as dowry insurance. Picture this: if the crops fail, we can always sell your third molar. Or, should our child be toothless, we'll already have backups. It's gross. It's weird. But it's also kind of genius in that dark, practical, deeply unsettling way only old Europe could master. Let's not forget the symbolic angle. A tooth was personal, intimate, permanent, like giving someone your heart only you know enamel. Some cultures believe that gifting a tooth meant bonding your soul to another person. Others thought it was a sign of dominance. Here I gave you my tooth. I now own your chewing power forever. Either way, it was a gesture that screamed commitment and mild psychosis. There's even archaeological evidence of wedding rings and brooches made with human teeth. That's right, people wore them, displayed them, flaunted them. A brooch with your husband's canines so chic. Earrings made from your dead aunt's molars, très chic and deeply cursed. It wasn't just dental bling, it was spiritual. Tacky, yes. Haunted, also yes. But at the time, peak romance. And oh, the poetry. Medieval love letters occasionally included lines like "Thy smile be more radiant than the pearl of thy tooth," or "I would pull mine own for thee." Not metaphorically, literally. Some lovers did. Pulled out a tooth and mailed it. Nothing says devotion like bloody enamel arriving by carrier pigeon. The church, of course, had opinions, as usual. Some priests condemned the gifting of teeth as vanity. Others claimed it was sacred. After all, saints' teeth were relics revered and kissed and locked in golden boxes. So what was the difference really between St. Apollonia's molar and your cousin's front tooth mounted in a locket? Answer centuries of martyrdom and slightly better dental hygiene. Peasant reactions range from horrified to meh. Some saw it as an opportunity, lose a tooth gain, a loaf of bread. Others refused outright, leading to forced extractions, drunken bribes, and at least one recorded incident of tooth theft at a wedding. That's right. A man got so jealous of another guest's smile that he hired someone to knock him out and steal his incisor. And you thought modern weddings had drama? And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, children's teeth. Some couples collected baby teeth like trophies, especially if they were noble-born. They kept them in jars, embedded them in wedding crowns, or carried them around as charms for fertility. May this tiny tooth bring us many heirs. That's not romantic. That's a fairy tale gone full grim. Of course, the trend eventually faded. People realised that transplanting foreign body parts without sterilisation or consent might not be ideal. Dentures got better. Porcelain became a thing. But the legacy lives on in weird family heirlooms and dusty love poems written in bleeding ink. Somewhere out there in a noble family vault sits a golden box containing Aunt Beatrice's wisdom tooth, engraved bejewelled and deeply cursed. And here's the kicker. Modern engagement culture isn't so different. We gift diamonds, pressurised carbon dug from the earth, costing fortunes and sometimes lives. Medieval people gifted teeth, pressurised trauma pulled from mouths costing blood, and probably trauma counselling. Same obsession with symbolism, same misplaced priorities. One just comes with better lighting. So next time you're at a wedding and someone says, "Oh, look at the ring, just smile," and be grateful it's not a molar on a string. Because love may be eternal, but plaque is forever. There was no escape, no Novocaine, no sterile gloves, no gentle, "you'll feel a pinch." In medieval times, if a tooth decided to betray you with a festering ache, the solution wasn't a clinic visit, it was a death match between you and your own jaw. And for many, the only tools available were a piece of string, a door, and an iron will. The concept of do-it-yourself dentistry wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was survival. In villages far from the bustling cities or even within them when coin was scarce, people took matters into their own shaking, pain-riddled hands. The logic was simple. The tooth hurts. The tooth must leave. I have a door. Let's make history. Sounds absurd now, but back then it was as common as baking bread. The most infamous method, the string and slam. You tied one end of a coarse string to your throbbing tooth. The other end went to the handle of a heavy wooden door. Then, with breath held and prayers mumbled, someone, often a helpful relative, or the village idiot, slammed that door shut. Fast. The idea was to let the sudden force yank the tooth out in one swift, horrifying motion. Best case success and tears. Worst case broken tooth-torn gum, shattered pride. Children were not spared from this medieval madness. In fact, they were often the test subjects for these experiments. Baby teeth come out easily, they'd say, and so little ones were bribed with honey cakes or apples, then tied to the village door for a yank so traumatic it probably echoed in their dreams for decades. No therapy. Just a pat on the head, and now go rinse with ale. For those too terrified of doors, there were other methods. Heated pliers were one. You'd shove a red-hot pair of blacksmith tongs into your mouth and hope for the best. Or if you lacked tools, fingers and bravery could suffice. Just grip the tooth and twist until it gave up. That's if the infection hadn't already fused it to your skull. Alcohol played a central role, of course. Not for sterilization, don't be ridiculous, but for courage. A pint of mead or a jug of cider was the anesthesia of the poor. Some even believed that if you drank enough wine, the tooth would simply slide out on its own. It didn't. But by the time your world started spinning, you no longer cared about your dental woes or your dignity. Desperate times called for desperate folk remedies. One technique involved biting on a stone while someone punched your jaw from the side. The idea. The impact would loosen the tooth enough for you to wiggle it free. Others chewed on raw garlic and charcoal until the gum tissue went numb, or until they fainted from the taste. Pain relief, it turns out, was often just another word for distraction. Superstition, as always, was never far behind. Some believed that whispering your pain into a clay figure and then burying it would trick the toothache into going away. Others wore amulets made from wolf teeth, believing it would ward off tooth demons. And when nothing worked, there was always the village witch ready to chant incantations, spit on your cheek, and charge you half a chicken. Interestingly, some barbers and blacksmiths offered tooth extraction as a side hustle. They'd keep a pair of rusty pliers beside the shears or the anvil, their technique brutal but straightforward twist, Pull-opic comes out in one piece. There are accounts of teeth being pulled in back alley stables even during market days in front of a curious crowd. Public dental horror was practically street entertainment. Now it's easy to look back and laugh or wince, but this was life. Real life. People were so desperate to escape pain they were willing to tear parts of themselves out with zero knowledge of anatomy. Gums were sliced open, roots were shattered. Sometimes the wrong tooth was removed altogether, leading to days of double agony. But you didn't get to complain. You bit a leather strap, swallowed your scream, and thanked the stars it wasn't your eye. Let's not forget the infection roulette that followed. These DIY extractions were almost always done in filthy conditions. Hands dirty, tools reused, mouth unwashed. The open socket was a red carpet for bacteria. Some mouths festered, some faces swelled until eyes shut. And in many tragic cases, people died from an attempt to do dentistry with a door hinge and blind hope. One grim example comes from a 14th century journal in York, where a man named Elias attempted to extract his own molar using a hammer, chisel and nail. He succeeded in breaking the tooth and his jaw. He spent the next 6 days in fever before succumbing to sepsis. His last recorded words, "Tell Martha I was right." One can only guess what that argument was about. But DIY dental heroes weren't always tragic. Some succeeded and were celebrated, sort of. A villager who managed to pull out their own infected tooth and survive the aftermath was seen as something between a local legend and a cautionary tale. People would come by to ask questions. What kind of string? How far from the door did it hurt? Answer yes, of course it hurt. And for those who couldn't muster the courage for door-related violence, there was always the slow rot approach. That is, do nothing. Let the tooth die, blacken, crumble, and eventually fall out on its own. It might take months, it might take years. In the meantime, you lived with constant pain, swelling, and the unmistakable aroma of death in your mouth. Many preferred that over the door. Cultural variations abounded. In some Slavic villages, toothaches were believed to be curses sent by jealous neighbours. The solution: burn hair from the suspect's cloak and rub the ash into your gum. In rural Italy, placing a frog in your mouth alive was thought to absorb the pain. The frog had no comment, and in parts of northern Europe a particularly bold method involved hanging upside down and shaking your head until the tooth just fell out. Results mixed. Amazingly, this DIY spirit lasted well into the 19th century. Even when real dentists began popping up in cities, many rural folk still preferred a sturdy rope and a willing cousin over paying for a trained hand. It wasn't about cost necessarily, it was tradition. A weird, bloody, scream-filled tradition passed down through generations like a family recipe no one wanted, but everyone knew by heart. To this day you'll find folklore surrounding first teeth and last teeth. In parts of the British Isles, people used to keep their extracted teeth in little pouches and bury them under apple trees for good luck. Some parents pulled their children's loose teeth with fishing line and treated it like a rite of passage. In some old houses, tiny string loops still hang near heavy doors, a silent tribute to DIY dentistry of generations past. And somehow, despite all the pain and madness, these tooth tales live on half horror, half legend. They remind us of a time when courage was measured by how many teeth you dared to pull, with nothing but a prayer and a plank of wood. It wasn't smart, it wasn't clean, but it was very, very human. So the next time you're reclining in a cushioned chair numbed with Novocaine watching soft music videos while your dentist gently polishes your molar, take a moment. Think of those who came before you, the ones who stood by a door, string in hand, heart pounding, screaming into the wind, and maybe say a quiet thank you that DIY dentistry died before you were born. Being born into royalty during the Middle Ages came with obvious advantages: silks, feasts, palaces, armies at your whim. But when it came to teeth, the crown offered no protection. Toothaches didn't kneel before a king or spare a queen's radiant smile. In fact, the nobler, The birth, the worse the dental fate. A gilded goblet of honeyed wine might dull the pain for a while, but in the end no throne could shield a rotting molar. Let's begin with the infamous King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. A man of opulent grandeur and tragically excruciating dental agony. His royal teeth began failing early. Records note he had several molars yanked out in his 30s, often without anesthesia. One particularly botched procedure left a hole in the roof of his mouth connecting his nasal cavity to his mouth. Soup would leak from one orifice to the other. Dignity gone with the first cracked incisor. Royal dentists, if you can call them that, were often little more than glorified barbers with steady hands and well-ironed coats. Their main qualification was not making the monarch bleed out on the spot. Some believed in rituals, burning herbs, chanting psalms, waving relics over the king's mouth. Others dove straight in with iron tools and blind hope. The patient, be it a prince or a pope, was expected to endure the torture with stoic silence. But many screamed, loudly, and sometimes publicly, "Consider Queen Elizabeth I of England, regal, fierce, and utterly terrified of dentists." She famously refused to have a rotting tooth pulled until the pain drove her mad. According to legend, she eventually consented only after one of her bishops had a perfectly healthy tooth pulled in front of her to prove it wasn't so bad. The bishop fainted. The Queen then relented. Royal bravery, it seems, had its limits. Yet dental pain wasn't just a matter of discomfort, it was a political hazard. Kings who grimaced too often were seen as weak. A monarch clutching his jaw in council could be mistaken for indecision. In court paintings, teeth were rarely shown not just for aesthetic reasons, but because many royal mouths were crumbling behind closed lips. Portraits lied. Breath stank. Some kings stuffed cloves or cinnamon in their cheeks to mask decay during audiences. Some, like King Philip II of Spain, reportedly ground opium into paste and packed it into his gums. Royal chefs didn't help. While peasants gnawed on coarse bread and onions, the aristocracy feasted on sugar-laced delicacies, candied fruits, and wine-soaked meats. They believed sweetness was a sign of refinement. But those dainty tarts were silent assassins rotting the teeth of kings from within. The nobility practically brushed their molars with syrup. By the time a prince hit 30, his mouth often resembled a crumbling wall in need of siege repairs. The royal courts of Europe became breeding grounds for bizarre dental cures. In one Italian court, aristocrats rubbed rabbit brains mixed with mint on their gums. In Prussia, powdered emeralds were ingested to harden the teeth. In France, royal ladies gargled with rosewater salt and crushed pearls. None of it worked. All of it cost a fortune. And yet the rot marched on slow and silent. Even the Holy Roman emperors were not spared. Emperor Frederick II suffered chronic tooth infections in his later years. He ordered his servants to apply leeches to his jaw to draw out the evil humours. His royal diary includes lines such as "woke in agony" and "bitter abscess lingers." He died not long after an especially aggressive molar turned septic. The cause on record: fever. But historians whisper death by decay. When infection set in, even monarchs had no recourse. A simple abscess could lead to brain swelling or sepsis. Royal physicians might prescribe bleeding or purging, none of which addressed the festering mouth. In rare cases, surgeries were attempted, cutting open the jaw, drain the black blood. Few survived. Fewer wanted to try. So instead, kings sat in their marble chambers, clutching silk handkerchiefs, silently weeping from the throbbing agony behind jewelled crowns. There were darker stories too. In Poland, King Władysław IV was said to have died after a dental abscess triggered a seizure during battle preparation. In Hungary, Queen Elizabeth of the House of Arpad became addicted to opiates after a botched tooth extraction left her with phantom jaw pain for years. And in Denmark court, physicians attempted to treat King Christian IV's dental rot by cauterizing his palate. He survived but could no longer speak without a whistle. Diplomacy suffered. Curiously, peasants sometimes envied royal teeth not for their health but for their worth. Teeth pulled from nobles, especially those lost in pain, were seen as magical objects. Some were buried under thresholds for protection. Others were ground into powder for potions. A tooth from a prince was worth a small fortune in certain markets. And if a royal molar still had gold leaf on it, it could buy you a cow, a goose, and a plot of land. In the East, similar stories echoed. The Ming Dynasty emperors indulged in sugared tea and dried fruits, leading to decayed teeth hidden behind painted lips. Courtiers were instructed never to mention the smell of royal breath. In Japan, some noblewomen blackened their teeth with iron filings and vinegar, a beauty trend called ohaguro, that masked decay while embracing it. In truth, many were already losing teeth by their 20s. Back in the West, the Renaissance brought new tools, but not necessarily better results. Metal pliers were refined. Mouth speculums became more precise, but pain remained constant. Some monarchs ordered tooth sessions at court where barbers lined up with velvet cases and nobles watched the extractions like theatre. Blood sprayed, servants fainted, but the king's jaw was lightened until the next tooth decided to rebel. Royal children too were not spared the torment. Imagine a 6-year-old dauphin strapped to a throne, a priest reading psalms while a barber pulled out baby teeth to make way for honour, or a young archduchess fed honey wine daily, only to lose all her molars by age 14. One French princess had her mouth packed with wool soaked in vinegar and urine for weeks to preserve her beauty. By her wedding day, she couldn't smile. One might think queens fared better, but they did not. Catherine de' Medici was rumoured to have halitosis so severe that her lovers wore perfumed rags under their noses. Anne of Austria hid her blackened teeth with lace veils, and Queen Isabella of Spain refused to open her mouth in public after a failed dental procedure left her with a crooked jaw and a lisp. In a world obsessed with appearances, a royal mouth could be both power and prison, but perhaps no story captures the horror better than that of King Henry VIII. By the time he reached his later years, Henry was bloated, infected, and riddled with ulcers both in body and in mouth. His teeth had rotted nearly to the gum. He was prone to fits of rage, often triggered by pain in his jaw. One courtier wrote, "When the king scowls, the air stinks of rot. He died a miserable death, his breath sour, his teeth long gone, his kingdom bitter." And yet even in death, royal teeth were significant. Corpses of kings were sometimes examined and their remaining teeth catalogued in journals. Some were pulled and displayed, others were hidden in tombs as relics. A king who died with white intact teeth was seen as blessed. One who died with none was whispered to have been punished by God. Dental legacy, oddly enough, became part of royal reputation. Today we speak of royalty with awe, crowns, palaces, power. But history reminds us they were just flesh and bone, and when it came to teeth, their suffering was no less savage than that of the poorest stable boy. In fact, with all the sugar vanity and misguided medicine, it may have been worse. Behind every golden goblet and powdered wig, there was likely an aching molar screaming for mercy. So next time you read about kings and queens of old, imagine their portraits with lips curled back, revealing gaps, rot and decay. Behind every royal decree may have been the wince of a tooth too far gone. Behind every war, a monarch losing sleep to a relentless abscess. Death by decay wasn't just possible, it was expected. In the long candlelit corridors of medieval medicine, few things inspired more awe and more dread than the tiny wriggling creature known as the leech. Black, slippery, and inexplicably sacred, these bloodsuckers were viewed not as pests, but as healing agents sent by divine providence. If your gums bled, your jaw throbbed, or your breath reeked of rot, the remedy wasn't mint or medicine. It was often a leech lovingly applied by a barber surgeon with steady hands and no real qualifications. The idea: suck out the bad blood, the evil humours, the sins clinging to your swollen gums. And with enough blood drawn, perhaps your soul would feel lighter too. Leeches were considered a form of balance restoration in the medieval understanding of the body. According to humoral theory, your health depended on 4 key fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much blood meant heat swelling and madness, hence those bleeding gums or inflamed jaws. And rather than question your sugar-laced diet or rotting teeth, healers declared the answer clear: you had too much blood in your face. Time to release the excess through a creature who never asked for consent but was always eager to help. The process began with ritualistic precision. You'd be led into a room that smelled of vinegar and iron. You'd sit in a creaky wooden chair, gripping its arms while the barber unwrapped a cloth pouch of damp, wriggling leeches. They came from the nearest pond, ideally after a fasting period to ensure their hunger. One would be gently placed on your gum lip or cheek, anywhere the blood could rise to meet its fangs. And then you waited. Minutes passed as the leech latched, wiggled, and began to drink with silent enthusiasm. To the patient, the sensation was eerie, not quite pain, more like a slow pulling a dull ache, the strange warmth of blood flowing where it shouldn't. Many described it as a humbling experience. Some fainted. Others gagged as the taste of iron seeped into their mouths. The lucky ones merely endured the bleeding. The unlucky developed infections, ulcers, or worse. But through it all, a leech kept drinking unbothered by screams or tears. And once full, it dropped off with the grace of a tiny, bloated aristocrat. The leeches weren't always placed on the gums directly. In some monasteries and healing houses, practitioners believed the blood vessels in the temples or behind the ears better connected to the mouth. So if your gums ached, they might strap a leech to your neck and chant a prayer. In noble courts, bleeding became performance art. Guests watched as counts and duchesses reclined, while leeches sucked at their jaws in solemn silence like some grotesque form of beauty treatment. And in rare cases, children had leeches attached to their baby teeth to guide them out with grace. There were also specialised leeches, yes, really. The best ones were said to come from clean, fast-moving rivers raised in solitude, not fed for months. Apothecaries sold them by weight, with notes like 4 for fever, 6 for face, 8 for the soul. Some physicians even named their leeches. A particularly gluttonous one might be called Mercy, another the Judge. They became tools of both healing and spectacle. One chronicler in the 13th century wrote of a leech named Dominicus, who had tasted more noble blood than any knight alive. Of course, it wasn't all belief and ritual. Sometimes it worked, or seemed to. After a bleeding session, some patients genuinely felt better. Less pressure in the jaw, less throbbing pain. Whether from the release of built-up fluids or sheer relief that the session was over, we may never know. But the appearance of improvement cemented the leech's place in the medieval medical arsenal. If it didn't heal you, it humbled you, and that was good enough for most healers. But the risks were real. The open wounds left by leeches often became infected, especially in filthy environments. Pus-filled ulcers were common, sometimes more painful than the original gum issue. And occasionally leeches wouldn't detach properly. They had to be burned off or pried loose with a metal hook. If done carelessly, this could tear the flesh or leave behind teeth marks that bled for days. In the worst cases, leeches crawled deeper into the mouth, under the tongue, or into nasal passages. There are at least 2 recorded deaths from internal leech lodging. That's a phrase no one wants to read in their family's Bible. The psychological effects weren't minor either. Children raised in towns with bleeding houses often feared the leech more than the rod. Some adults developed an aversion to water, believing ponds harboured tiny vampires. Superstitions blossomed. Some claimed that if a leech drank your blood while you cursed, it would whisper your sins to the devil. Others believed that swallowing a live leech, yes, this was done, would cleanse your soul from lust. Predictably, this often ended in internal bleeding and swift regret. The church had mixed feelings. On one hand, anything that involved suffering could be seen as a path to purification. On the other, Some priests declared leeches unholy creatures of the swamp, symbolic of gluttony. But when bishops suffered from gum boils or jaw rot, they were among the first to send for the leech pouch. Pope Innocent IV reportedly had leeches applied to his tongue during an illness, an image so surreal it inspired woodcut illustrations for generations. By the 15th century, religious monasteries were breeding leeches for sale. Sanctified blood-sucking now with papal blessing. As strange as it sounds, bleeding became a social norm. If someone at market had dark rings under their eyes and red welts on their cheeks, it was understood they'd been treated. Young brides had their gums bled before weddings to ensure clarity of the tongue. Knights bled before battle to sharpen the raw. In some towns, bleeding was a monthly ritual. Gums, forearms, ankles, it didn't matter where. What mattered was that you let something out. Peasants, of course, had less access to fancy leeches and professional bleeders. They made do with whatever the swamp offered. Children were sent with clay pots to gather suckworms, which were smaller, wild versions of medical leeches. Often these creatures were misidentified, leading to rashes, fevers, or worse. In one tragic folk tale from the Low Countries, a girl used a garden worm on her cheek and died from sepsis 3 days later. Her family claimed the worm whispered her fate as it fed. The tale became a warning: trust only the bloodsucker you pay for. By the late Middle Ages, some skepticism emerged. Surgeons who had travelled east brought back new ideas: dental forceps, gum powders, herbal rinses. But old habits died hard. In England, leeching remained common well into the 17th century. Even as Renaissance thinkers dissected human anatomy and mapped nerves, there were still apothecaries who insisted a good gum bleed could save a marriage-cure melancholy or even prevent bad dreams. It wasn't just humans who got the treatment either. Valuable horses, falcons, and even dogs were leeched for dental swelling. A prized mastiff in Burgundy reportedly had 7 leeches to the jaw after refusing meat for a week. Noblemen paid handsomely for veterinarians who specialised in such procedures. In this way, the practice became part of a broader belief system, one where teeth, blood, mood, and morality were inextricably linked. As we look back on this practice now, it's easy to scoff, to gag a little, to wince. But to the medieval mind it made perfect sense. The mouth was a sacred and dangerous place. It carried words and curses, songs and secrets, and when it suffered it meant something had gone terribly out of balance, not just physically, but spiritually. To let a leech feed on your pain was to acknowledge that pain could be shared, that something living could carry part of your suffering away. Today, the leech survives in modern medicine, cleaned, cultivated, and used in rare cases to restore blood flow after surgery. But its medieval cousin lived in a darker, wetter world, one where the gums bled not just with infection, but with centuries of superstition, a world where to smile too wide was to risk revealing your wounds, and where healing often arrived with a squirm and a bite. So next time you feel a twinge in your molar, be grateful for your dentist. And remember, had you lived 600 years ago, you might be sitting in a wooden chair watching a leech dangle from your lip like some horrifying jewel. The bleeding wouldn't stop the decay, but maybe it would make you feel medievally balanced. In the medieval world, pain wasn't an obstacle, it was an inevitability, especially when it came to anything involving teeth. There were no syringes of Novocaine, no gas to send you into a blissful sleep. There was only the task at hand, removing the rotten tooth before the infection spread, and the body followed it into the grave. For that you needed courage, some ale, and preferably a gag to bite down on. Screaming wasn't discouraged, it was expected. Tooth pain wasn't a gentle throbbing. It was a pulsing, maddening agony that radiated from the jaw, up through the eyes, down the neck, sometimes even into the chest. It made eating impossible. Talking unbearable, sleeping a distant dream. When someone arrived at the village fair or monastery clinic with a swollen cheek and sunken eyes, everyone knew it was tooth time, and no one left the scene of medieval dentistry unchanged. The dentist was rarely a dentist at all. More often, he was a travelling barber, a blacksmith with a steady hand, or even a peddler with a pair of tongs and a persuasive grin. There were no formal qualifications, just experience, reputation, and a willingness to work in blood. Tools were rudimentary metal forceps forged by hand-rusted iron hooks, wedges carved from bone or antler. If the patient was lucky, the tools had been washed. If not, they still bore flecks of someone else's pain. Before the operation preparations were made, the patient might be given ale, lots of it, enough to dull the senses, loosen the limbs, and in some cases knock them unconscious. If ale was scarce, they'd bite a strip of leather, a wooden spoon, or the hem of their tunic. Some prayed. Others cursed the heavens. Children were often sent away. Not because of the blood, but because the sounds could scar a young mind for life. With the patient subdued, or at least seated, the tooth puller would begin. There were no x-rays, no diagnostics beyond "that one looks black," or "she says it hurts here." The forceps were clamped around the offending tooth with terrifying speed. Then came the twist, the wrench, the upward jerk. If it came out clean, the relief was immediate and immense, but if it broke, if part of the root stayed behind, it became a prolonged battle. Flesh torn, bones splintered, gums ripped wide like paper in the rain, and all the while screaming. It echoed through towns and forests, across courtyards and chapel walls, a sound so familiar it barely turned heads. People screamed in pain, in fear, in fury. Some passed out halfway through. Others had to be restrained by 3 or 4 stout helpers. There are reports of patients punching their surgeons in the gut, kicking wildly, even biting the hands that tried to help. But no one blamed them. The pain was not just intense, it was cosmic. For women, the procedure carried an added weight. Not only was it agonizing, it was also seen as unladylike to make noise. So many bore the pain in silence, their eyes watering, their hands clenched into the skirts of their gowns. Afterward, they were praised for their stoicism, as if suffering quietly made them more virtuous. For men, it was a test of strength. How long could they hold still before roaring like a lion? How many fingers would they crush in their grip before the tooth came free? Of course there were alternatives. Numbing agents from nature existed, though they were unreliable. Mandrake root could dull sensation, but too much might stop the heart. Henbane and belladonna were poisonous in large doses. Clove oil was sometimes applied directly to the gums, but it was weak and fleeting. The most common solution remained ale and more ale. In wealthier courts, spiced wine or mead infused with poppy juice was the prelude to tooth pulling. But it wasn't anesthesia. It was just distraction. In monasteries, the monks had their own approach: prayer, reflection, a belief that enduring pain brought one closer to God. Some monks voluntarily had teeth removed to purge the sin of vanity, especially if the tooth was visible when they smiled. They'd sit in stone cells, heads bowed, chanting psalms while blood dripped into wooden bowls. Their suffering was sacred, their screams woven into devotion. It was agony turned into liturgy. Children weren't spared. If a child had a decayed baby tooth that wouldn't fall out, the remedy was often string and door or brute force. Sometimes a tooth was yanked mid-meal under the guise of surprise. Other times a tooth puller specialising in youth was called in, a figure often dressed in colourful rags to distract the frightened little ones. But the results were the same: tears, howls, blood. Parents wept too, but knew it was better than a festering jaw. In medieval logic, short-term pain was better than long-term death. One of the cruel ironies was how many teeth were removed that didn't need to be. With no way to differentiate a reversible ache from a serious infection, the default was always removal. If it hurt, yank it. If it bled, bleed it more. If it made noise when tapped out, it went. This meant people often walked away from medieval dentistry with gaping mouths, broken jaws, and more missing teeth than necessary. Smiling was rare, not because of shame, but because it physically hurt. After the tooth was removed, there was little in the way of follow-up care. A cloth soaked in vinegar might be applied. Some healers used crushed herbs, sage thyme or rosemary to pack the hole. Others cauterized the gum with a hot iron, searing the wound shut with a hiss and a scream. The smell of burned flesh was so common in healing halls it barely drew comment. If you survived the week without fever or swelling, you were considered fortunate. If you didn't, well, you were added to the statistics no one wrote down, and yet people kept going. They lined up tooth in hand or jaw in agony, hoping for relief. Word travelled fast when a skilled puller arrived in town. Markets would swell with the desperate and the brave. Some tooth pullers worked on stages turning extractions into public theatre. Trumpets blared. Assistants danced. A volunteer was chosen, the tooth yanked, and the crowd cheered. Blood was part of the show. The louder the scream, the better the applause. But not everyone found this festive. In smaller villages, tooth-pulling was sombre, a moment of grim necessity. The patient was wrapped in blankets, held by friends and whispered to as if facing execution. Stories were told, prayers murmured, family gathered close. A tooth was more than enamel, it was part of the body's lineage, a relic of ancestors, a symbol of strength. To lose one felt like losing a piece of your voice, your smile, your story. Among the nobility things were slightly more refined. Private physicians performed extractions in candlelit chambers, often with scented oils and silk rags. But the tools were the same. The pain was the same. King Henry IV reportedly lost several teeth in his final years, each pulled without anesthesia, each remembered in his private journal as a war fought in the mouth. Even kings couldn't escape the tyranny of a tooth gone bad. By the end of the medieval period, some began experimenting with sedation. Ether was whispered of. Alcohol infusions. The early seeds of anesthetic science. But those belonged to the future. For most of the medieval world, there was no dreamless void to slip into. Only the cold metal of the forceps, the hand on your shoulder, the ale burning your throat, and your scream echoing into the rafters. And afterward relief. The kind that flooded the limbs like lightning. The kind that brought laughter through tears. Some wept for joy. Others fell asleep where they sat. There was blood on their chins, pain in their eyes, and often a gaping space where a tooth once stood. But the ache was gone, and that was enough. So when you next visit your clean, climate-controlled dentist's office, remember the ones who came before. The peasants who bit wood, the children who screamed into cloth, the kings who clenched their fists beneath golden rings. There was no anesthesia, only ale and screaming. In the medieval world, your teeth spoke before you did. Not in whispers, but in the loud, unmistakable language of rot gaps and colour. Long before you opened your mouth to say who you were, your smile, if you dared to show it, declared your status. Tooth decay wasn't just a dental issue. It was a social marker. And for centuries, a mouthful of ruin told the world whether you harvested the wheat or hoarded the sugar. Peasants, labourers and farmers, those closest to the earth, often had surprisingly healthy teeth. Their diets were coarse but simple bread made from whole grains, root vegetables pulled fresh from the soil and meat only on rare feast days. They chewed on hard crusts and fibrous greens which unknowingly scrubbed their enamel clean. Sugar. That was a fantasy reserved for kings and clergy. The peasant's mouth might be chipped and worn, but it wasn't filled with black rot. Now travel upward through the social ladder and things begin to stink literally. Nobles and wealthy merchants had access to imported luxuries, candied fruits from the Levant honey-sweetened pastries, and rich sauces designed to show off their spice cabinets. With every sticky delight came a hidden, tax, slow, festering decay. The irony was bitter. The more wealth you had, the more likely your mouth was a battleground of pain. To rot was to rise. Among royal courts, this became almost absurd. Sugar was a symbol of power. Hosting a banquet meant flooding the tables with candied almonds, glazed hams, sugared violets. To say no to sweets was to insult the host. And so mouths rotted in service of vanity and protocol. Monarchs developed puffy cheeks, bad breath. and visible black stubs, but all in the name of refinement. To have decayed teeth was to say, I can afford it. Some wore their ruin like a badge. In certain European courts, dark teeth were considered fashionable. The Japanese even adopted a practice called ohaguro, blackening the teeth intentionally as a mark of maturity and elegance. In Europe, the black came naturally. Nobles didn't brush. They rinsed with wine, picked with feathers, dabbed herbs on bleeding gums, but the sugar always won. Behind the velvet and lace was the breath of fermentation. The church was not immune either. High-ranking clergy feasted alongside nobles, enjoying the same luxuries in the cloisters of power. Monasteries that brewed ale and raised bees had plenty of honey. And while monks often fasted feast days were indulgent affairs. Bishops and abbots had teeth that mirrored the nobility, worn down, discoloured, plagued with abscesses. Their spiritual purity did little to protect them from the rot of indulgence. Meanwhile, the merchant class grew more ambitious and their mouths followed. As trade routes expanded, more families could afford jams, biscuits, and sugary treats from abroad. With wealth came aspiration, and with aspiration came decay. Children of merchants were the first in their villages to lose teeth not from trauma, but from caramelized dreams. Their smiles began to resemble their betters, and so too did their pain. Yet decay was not evenly distributed. A serf with a cavity might suffer in silence for years, but a noble with a toothache summoned an army physicians, herbalists, even astrologers. Treatments were varied and absurd: clove poultices, bloodletting prayers, gold-infused tonics. Sometimes a decayed tooth was left in as a sign of endurance. Other times it was yanked ceremoniously in front of an audience as a show of resilience and grit, because tooth decay carried meaning. It marked those who could feast daily and those who nibbled sparingly. A man missing molars from infection might command armies, while the farmer with all his teeth intact was dismissed as lowborn. This strange reversal created a quiet irony in medieval medicine. Those with the most access to care had the worst teeth. The poor with their onions and cabbage laughed behind crooked but clean smiles. Of course, beauty standards weren't fixed. In some regions, missing teeth were considered unfortunate, a sign of weakness. In others, especially where sugar was king, a darkened grin hinted at wealth. Artists even painted royals with closed mouths to avoid the unsightly reality. Court painters knew that capturing a monarch's gap-toothed smirk could mean exile or worse, so smiles were softened, lips closed, chins lifted in pride. The truth stayed behind the veil. For women, the stakes were even higher. A noblewoman's smile was part of her value. Marriage prospects often involved subtle assessments, posture, manners, teeth. A decaying mouth could ruin a dowry. Remedies were applied with desperation pastes of crushed coral, powdered, bone-scented oils. Some painted their lips dark to distract from the blackened stumps beneath. Others wore veils longer than tradition demanded, hiding both modesty and molars. Peasant women, on the other hand, had no time for such pretences. They scrubbed with twigs chewed on mint and spat in the dirt. Their mouths were tools, not ornaments. They spoke loudly chewed roots and survived on tough bread that would send noble teeth screaming. They bore their children in the fields and laughed with gaps where teeth once stood, not from decay, but from falling during harvest or slipping on ice. Children were the great equalizer until sugar entered the picture. Among the poor young teeth remained surprisingly strong, but among the rich early access to sweets meant early decline. Children were given candied nuts, sugar-dipped fruits, honeyed milk. Their milk teeth blackened. Their cries in the night were answered with poppy syrup. Some lost their baby teeth before they could speak clearly. A rotting mouth was the price of privilege. This class, divide in decay, became so visible that it entered literature. Poets wrote of rosy lips and pearl-like teeth, but those were fantasies. Real love letters often avoided mouth imagery altogether. Instead, eyes and hair were praised. Smiles were rarely described unless the lover was from the countryside, a pastoral ideal untouched by sugar and rot. The city girl smiled with perfume. The country girl smiled with clean teeth. Dental care itself mirrored the divide. A peasant's care was preventative by default, no sweets, rough food, occasional twig brushing. A noble's care was reactive, dealing with rot once it appeared. The barber surgeon became a regular visitor to castles, travelling with a case of gleaming tools and questionable solutions. If a noble lost too many teeth, they might receive a prosthetic false teeth, carved from ivory, or bone tied with gold wire. Beautiful, expensive, and painful. Even in death, the teeth told tales. Skeletons unearthed from medieval cemeteries show the truth that paintings and poetry tried to hide. Nobles with ornate jewellery and silk remnants were often missing several teeth, with signs of deep infection in the jaw. Peasant remains, though rougher, often had nearly full sets of natural teeth with only minor wear. Archaeology confirms what the mirror once hinted: decay climbed with status. The divide wasn't just health, it was symbolic. A decayed tooth meant you had feasted. You had lived richly, if not wisely. Rot was a sign of indulgence. In a world that prized asceticism and self-denial, in theory, sugar consumption became a silent rebellion. To suffer for a cake was to flaunt your freedom. To scream from a sugar-induced abscess was to declare, "I have arrived." This strange pride in decay would eventually fade. As dentistry evolved, health returned to fashion. The Enlightenment brought brushes, better pastes, and a growing awareness that teeth mattered. But in the medieval age, they mattered for reasons that had little to do with cleanliness. They were visual testimonies of excess, symbols of access, banners of social decay. Your mouth wasn't yours, it was your class speaking through enamel, and in that way every tooth in medieval Europe carried a story, a root canal of power, a cavity of inequality, a crown not on the head but embedded in the molar of someone who could afford jam in January. So next time you brush your teeth, remember what you're holding isn't just hygiene, it's history. Let's be honest, your toothbrush is a miracle. A little plastic wand tipped with synthetic bristles, possibly electric, humming in your hand like a dental angel. It whirls with peppermint foam, and without much thought you scrub away centuries of ancestral struggle. There's no horsehair, no soot, no fraying twigs bitten into the shape of bristles. Just a 2-minute ritual before bed sometimes, while scrolling your phone, utterly unaware of how easy, how gloriously, laughably easy you have it. Because once upon a time, brushing your teeth wasn't a task, it was a fantasy. A concept so foreign that if you explained it to a 14th century peasant, they might mistake you for a prophet or a fool. You clean your teeth. Every day, twice, they'd blink. Why are you trying to lose them faster? Hygiene was a vague idea back then, a rumour passed through herbalists and monks. Teeth were just bones that betrayed you when you bit too hard. They were going to rot anyway, so why bother? But we do bother now. In fact, we're obsessed. We floss. We gargle. We count cavities like they're academic grades. We judge ourselves by our enamel and pay strangers to scrape our tartar with metal hooks, while soft music plays overhead. We've turned oral care into a billion-dollar empire built on fluoride vanity and fear of bad breath. It's a routine so normal, so dull, we forget it's a privilege hard-earned through centuries of suffering science, and quite a lot of screaming, so laugh. Really go ahead. Giggle at the absurdity. Laugh at the medieval noble who paid a goldsmith to carve false teeth out of ivory, only for them to fall out mid-banquet. Laugh at the poor soul who tied a string to a tooth and a doorknob and convinced themselves that bravery was the same as dental wisdom. Laugh at the monks who brewed mint teas not to freshen breath, but to keep demons away. Laugh at the barber surgeons who did everything except make the pain go away. And then laugh harder when you realise that once showing your teeth could get you accused of sorcery. That a woman with unusually clean teeth might be considered unnatural. that some believed toothaches were caused by tiny worms wriggling in your gums and they tried to smoke them out. We've come so far from leeches and cauterization that it's almost criminal not to smile wide at the modern miracle of a toothpaste commercial. You don't need honey wine to dull the agony. You don't need to bite on leather while someone yanks a molar with a rusted pair of tongs. You don't need to beg the village priest to pray over your swollen jaw. You just need a bathroom, a sink, and maybe a podcast to pass the time. You don't need prayers. You need fluoride. And your mouth has never had it so good. Think about it. No one's offering their pulled teeth as wedding gifts anymore. No one's fashioning dentures from sheep bone or trying to colour their teeth black to match the Queen. No one's hoarding cloves in case an abscess flares up. Even in the worst dental scenarios today, root canals, extractions, braces, you get anesthesia. You get numbed, calmed and stitched. You don't scream into the void. You sigh, pay the bill and schedule your next cleaning. And in all of that, there's something oddly beautiful. The idea that over centuries of decay and denial we figured it out. Slowly, painfully, with mistakes carved into skulls and molars lost in vanity's name, we finally learned how to keep our teeth. We made friends with mint. We stopped feeding the worms. We learned that pain isn't noble and that laughter, real laughter, sounds better with a full set of teeth. So the next time you lean over the sink, brush in hand, just pause. Pause and picture a medieval noble trying to understand what you're doing. Picture a peasant with perfect teeth scowling at a lord with blackened stubs. Picture monks pulling 300 teeth a month and the screams echoing down stone halls. Picture a girl smiling at her wedding, proud to show the gap where a gift tooth once lived. And now picture you smiling, minty, slightly bored. It's a good place to be. A mouth free of rot is a luxury that would have stunned half of history. A toothbrush isn't just hygiene, it's a daily victory. A tiny foamy rebellion against centuries of decay and pain. And the fact that it's so ordinary now, that's the best joke of all. So yes, brush your teeth. But don't forget to laugh while you do, because in the long grim story of dental history, you're the punchline with perfect teeth.